Hello everyone. Tonight I will tell you 15 strange and disturbing stories that explore the darkest corners of the human experience. These narratives are not for the faint of heart. They deal with isolation, madness, violence, and the unexplained. To help you navigate these heavy themes, this video is designed with the soothing sound of heavy rain and white noise in the background. This audio backdrop is intended to help you relax, perhaps even drift into a deep sleep, while your mind processes the complexities of the human condition safely from the comfort of your bed. Before we begin, I have a small request. If you enjoy this style of storytelling where we prioritize atmosphere and detail over sensationalism, please let the like button know by burying it in a snowbank and leaving it there until the spring thaw reveals it again. Also, please subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications. It ensures you never miss our weekly uploads. Now, double-check your door locks, pull your blanket up tight, and let us descend into the darkness together. Outside, the rain begins to fall gently against your window. It starts as a soft patter, a rhythmic drumming that washes away the stress of the day. Listen to it. The steady, relentless drop of water against glass. It creates a barrier between you and the world outside. In this safe space, surrounded by the hypnotic sound of the storm, the first story begins to emerge from the mist. The year is 1839, and we are drifting into the most dangerous stretch of ocean on Earth. Our story begins in the Drake Passage, a notorious body of water located between the southern tip of South America and the frozen continent of Antarctica. It is a place where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans collide, creating some of the most violent and unpredictable weather systems on the planet. For sailors in the 19th century, this was the end of the world. A place of gray skies, towering waves, and biting cold that could freeze a man's lungs in his chest. On the morning of September 23, 1839, an experienced mariner named Captain Brighton stood on the frost-covered deck of his ship. He was a whaler, a man accustomed to the harsh realities of the sea. He and his crew had ventured this far south, driven by the promise of a massive, untouched population of whales. Rumors had circulated in the ports that the Drake Passage was teeming with them, protected by the very danger of the location. But so far, the expedition had been a failure. The gray horizon remained empty. No spouts of water broke the surface. No massive flukes rose from the depths. Captain Brighton stared out at the endless expanse of icy water, his breath forming thick clouds of white vapor in the freezing air. The cold here was not just a temperature. It was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on the ship and the men aboard it. It seeped through their heavy wool coats and gnawed at their bones. The previous night had been particularly terrifying. The temperature had plummeted so drastically that the ocean surface had begun to freeze around the hull of the ship. For a sailor, this is a nightmare scenario. If the ice thickens enough, it can trap a vessel, holding it fast like a fly in amber. The crushing pressure of the shifting ice can splinter a wooden hull like a matchstick, leaving the crew stranded on a frozen plain thousands of miles from help. Captain Brighton had watched helplessly as the ice gripped his ship, anchoring them in place in the middle of the dark, churning ocean. The crew had waited in silence, listening to the groan of the timber and the shrieking of the wind. It seemed as though the Drake Passage had decided to claim them. But then, a stroke of luck arrived in the form of a violent storm. The gale-force winds and churning waves that would normally be a threat acted as their salvation. The sheer force of the storm broke up the ice sheet that had formed around them, shattering the prison that nature had built. By morning, the sea was liquid again, a churning slurry of black water and white ice chunks. Captain Brighton knew he had narrowly escaped disaster. Now, he faced a difficult choice. Should he push his luck and continue searching for whales in this frozen wasteland, or should he cut his losses and retreat to safer waters? He knew that staying meant risking another freeze, and next time, the ice might not let go. But leaving meant returning with an empty hold, a financial disaster for himself and his crew, who depended on the catch for their livelihood. He stood at the rail, wrestling with this decision, weighing the lives of his men against the economic necessity of the voyage. The wind howled around him, stinging his face with ice crystals, mocking his indecision. As he scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of life or a break in the weather, his eyes caught a shape in the distance. It was a dark blot against the endless gray of the sky and sea. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a hallucination born of fatigue and the endless monotony of the seascape. There should be nothing out here. No land, no islands, certainly no other ships. This was the edge of the known world. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. The shape remained. It was distinct, solid, and it was getting closer. As the object drifted slowly toward them, emerging from the mist like a phantom, Brighton realized it was indeed another vessel. His first instinct was that it must be a rival whaling ship. Who else would be foolish enough to sail these waters? He felt a pang of annoyance mixed with curiosity. Competition was the last thing he needed. But as the gap between the two vessels closed, the details of the stranger became clear, and Brighton's annoyance turned to confusion. This was not a sturdy whaling ship built for battering through ice. It was a schooner, a type of sailing vessel typically designed for speed and coastal travel, not for the brutal conditions of the Antarctic. It looked fragile against the backdrop of towering waves and drifting icebergs. The condition of the schooner was alarming. Even from a distance, Brighton could see that the sails were tattered and torn, hanging in ribbons from the yards. The hull was bleached and weathered, looking as though it had been stripped by the wind and salt over many years. There was a heavy list to the vessel, and it moved sluggishly through the water, not steered by a human hand but pushed aimlessly by the currents and the wind. There was an eerie stillness about the approaching ship. No figures moved on the deck, no smoke rose from the galley. It drifted in complete silence, a ghost ship emerging from the fog. Captain Brighton watched it through his spyglass, a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. Perhaps, he thought, they had been trapped in the ice just as his own ship had been. Maybe they had been stuck for weeks or months, their supplies dwindling, the crew weakening. The code of the sea is absolute. You aid those in distress. Brighton knew he could not simply sail away. If there were men aboard that wreck, they needed help, and they needed it now. He turned to his crew and barked out orders. They were to ready a dinghy and gather supplies, food, water, blankets. They would board the schooner, offer assistance, and see if anyone was left alive to tell the tale of what had happened. 4 men joined Captain Brighton in the small boat. They lowered it into the heaving, freezing waters of the Drake Passage and began to row toward the silent schooner. The wind bit at their exposed skin, and the spray from the waves froze on their clothes. As they drew closer, the silence of the other ship became oppressive. It was louder than the wind, louder than the waves. It was the silence of a tomb. Brighton steered the dinghy alongside the schooner's rotting hull. He could see the portholes, the small round windows along the side of the ship. Through the grime and the salt spray, he thought he could see shapes inside. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Yes, there were people in there. He could clearly see figures, unmoving, perhaps watching them. He called out, his voice lost in the wind. "Ahoy! Is anyone aboard?" There was no answer, no movement, just the dark shapes behind the glass and the creaking of the ship's timbers. The lack of response was chilling. If they were watching, why didn't they wave? Why didn't they call back? Brighton felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. He signaled his men to pull closer, and they hooked a ladder onto the side of the schooner. One by one, they climbed up the side of the vessel and vaulted over the railing onto the deck. The wood beneath their boots was slick with ice and slime. The rigging groaned overhead, the tattered sails snapping weakly in the breeze. The deck was deserted. Everything was in its place. The coils of rope, the buckets, the tools, but it all looked ancient, unused for a very long time. The silence here was profound. Brighton looked around, his hand instinctively resting on the knife at his belt. "Hello?" he shouted again. His voice echoed flatly across the empty deck. "We are here to help." Still nothing. He remembered the faces he had seen in the portholes. They had to be below deck. Perhaps they were too weak to come up. Perhaps they were sick. Or perhaps they were afraid. He motioned for his men to follow him. They walked cautiously across the treacherous deck toward the companionway that led down into the ship's interior. Specifically, the door that led to the captain's quarters. If anyone was in charge, they would be there. Brighton reached the heavy wooden door and knocked loudly. The sound was jarring in the quiet. He waited. Nothing. He tried the latch. It was stiff with ice and rust, but it gave way with a groan. Brighton pushed the door open and peered into the gloom. The air that wafted out was stale and dry, smelling of old paper and deep, undisturbed dust. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the dirty stern windows. It was the captain's cabin, a small, confined space cluttered with maps and books. Sitting at a desk at the far end of the room was a man. He was seated with his back to the door, his posture rigid and upright. He appeared to be writing in a journal, a quill pen still in his hand. He was wearing a thick wool coat, and a fur hat was pulled down low over his ears. Brighton felt a surge of relief mixed with confusion. Why hadn't the man answered? He took a step forward. "Captain?" he asked tentatively. The figure did not move. He did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge their presence in any way. Brighton took another step, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The man remained as still as a statue. A terrible suspicion began to dawn on Brighton. He moved closer, circling around the desk to get a look at the man's face. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. The man was not ignoring him. The man was dead. His skin was hard and gray, preserved perfectly by the intense, dry cold of the Antarctic. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the wall, a layer of frost coating his eyelashes. He was frozen solid, frozen in the very act of writing his final entry. The ink in the well had long since dried, and the quill was frozen to his fingers. Brighton felt a wave of nausea. He looked down at the journal that lay open on the desk. The handwriting was shaky, the letters jagged, as if written by a hand that was losing its strength. He leaned in closer to read the final words of this silent sentinel. The entry was brief and heartbreaking. "Trapped by icebergs," it read. "Despite all efforts, the fire went out last night. No hope remains." It was a testament to despair, a final message to a world they would never see again. But as unsettling as those words were, it was the line above them that made Brighton's blood run cold. He stared at the date, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. The entry was dated January 17th, 1823. Brighton looked at his men, then back at the date. It was currently 1839. This man, this crew, they had been dead for 16 years. For 16 long years, this ship had been drifting through the ice and fog of the Drake Passage, a floating tomb carrying its frozen crew through eternity. They had been trapped in the ice just as Brighton had been the night before, but for them, the ice had never broken. The storm never came to save them. They had waited and frozen and died. Brighton and his men left the cabin in a daze. They moved deeper into the ship, driven by a morbid curiosity to see the rest of the crew. They descended into the crew's quarters, the air growing colder and heavier with every step. What they found there was a scene frozen in time, a macabre tableau of daily life interrupted by the finality of death. In the mess hall, they found sailors sitting around a wooden table. They were holding cards in their hands, their faces locked in expressions of concentration or amusement. They had frozen to death in the middle of a game, the cold taking them so swiftly or so insidiously that they hadn't even laid down their hands. It was a ghostly game of poker that had lasted for nearly 2 decades. Further inside, in a small cabin, they found a woman. She was lying in a bunk, curled up under a pile of blankets. Beside her, nestled against her chest, was the frozen body of a small dog. They had died together, seeking warmth in each other's presence as the fire went out and the cold crept in. The woman's face was peaceful, as if she were simply sleeping, waiting for a morning that would never come. Everywhere they looked, they found bodies. Sailors in their hammocks, men sitting on chests, people frozen in the midst of conversation or prayer. The extreme cold of the Antarctic had acted as the ultimate preservative, halting the process of decay and keeping the crew of the schooner exactly as they had been in their final moments. They were statues of flesh and bone, passengers on a ghost ship that refused to sink. Captain Brighton and his men hurried back to the deck, the oppressive atmosphere of the death ship weighing heavily on them. They scrambled down the ladder and into their dinghy, rowing away as fast as their arms could carry them. They left the schooner drifting in the mist, a silent monument to the power of nature and the fragility of human life. They returned to their own ship, grateful for the warmth, for the noise, for the simple fact of being alive. As they sailed away, leaving the ghost ship to disappear back into the fog from which it came, Captain Brighton couldn't shake the image of the man at the desk. The captain who had sat there for 16 years, pen in hand, waiting for someone to read his final words. The Drake Passage kept its secrets well, and for 16 years it had kept the Octavius and her crew in a cold, eternal embrace. The ice of the Antarctic fades into the white noise of history, replaced by the steady rhythm of the rain that continues to fall outside your window. It is a cleansing sound, washing away the frost of the previous story, but it cannot wash away the darkness of human nature. That remains, constant and predatory, regardless of the climate. From the freezing isolation of the Southern Ocean, we move now to a place of golden sun and crashing waves, a paradise that hides a very sharp set of teeth. The rain taps against the glass, a hypnotic metronome counting down the moments of a vacation that was supposed to last forever. Imagine that sound transforming into the crash of surf against a rocky shore. We are traveling to the rugged coastline of Baja California, Mexico. It is late April in the year 2024. The air is thick with salt and the smell of dry sagebrush. This is a place where the desert meets the sea, a landscape of stark, beautiful contrasts that draws seekers from all over the world. 3 men had come to this coast, chasing a feeling that only surfers truly understand. It is the search for the perfect wave, the empty break, the moment of total freedom where the only thing that matters is the water moving beneath your feet. They were young, strong, and full of life, the kind of men who seemed invincible in the way that only the healthy and happy can appear. They had no way of knowing that they had driven their white pickup truck not into a playground, but into a hunting ground. Jake Robinson was 30 years old, a doctor from Perth, Australia. He was a man who had dedicated his life to healing others, a profession that requires empathy, precision, and a deep respect for human life. But outside of the hospital, his passion was the ocean. He was a traveler, an adventurer who sought to balance the high stakes of medicine with the simple, elemental joy of riding waves. He had flown halfway across the world to reunite with his brother and experience the legendary swells of the Pacific. His older brother, Callum Robinson, was 33. Standing at a towering 6 feet 4 inches, Callum was a physical force, a professional athlete who had built a life playing lacrosse in the United States. He was the kind of person who filled a room not just with his size, but with his energy. He was known for his big bear hugs and a smile that could disarm anyone. After a standout career in college lacrosse in Maryland, he he had settled in San Diego, embracing the California lifestyle. Rounding out the trio was their American friend, Jack Carter Rode, known to everyone as Carter. At 30 years old, Carter was a successful entrepreneur who had founded his own apparel company and worked in technology services. He was engaged to be married later that summer, a man with a clear and bright future mapped out before him. Like the Robinson brothers, he felt the pull of the ocean, the spiritual cleanse that comes from spending days on the water and nights under the stars. The plan was simple and enviable. They would take a road trip down the Baja Peninsula, camping along the coast, surfing remote breaks, and living the kind of carefree existence that most people only dream about. They loaded up a white Chevrolet Colorado pickup truck with surfboards, tents, and camping gear. It was the ultimate boys' trip, a celebration of friendship and freedom. They crossed the border with smiles on their faces, ready for tacos, beers, and the endless horizon. For the first few days, the trip was everything they had hoped for. Callum, ever the documentarian of their joy, posted photos to social media that captured the essence of the adventure. There they were, grinning over roadside tacos, the grease and salsa a testament to the authenticity of the experience. There were shots of them relaxing in a jacuzzi, beer bottles in hand, watching the sun dip below the Pacific, painting the sky in hues of violent orange and bruised purple. These images broadcast a narrative of pure happiness to their friends and family back home. They showed three men in their prime, soaking up the culture and the beauty of Mexico. The white Chevrolet Colorado became a character in their story, the trusty vessel carrying them from one break to the next. It was packed with their gear, a mobile base of operations for their quest for the perfect wave. But in Baja, visibility can be a double-edged sword. You see, while they were watching the waves, someone else was watching them. The white truck, with its California plates and its cargo of expensive equipment, was not just a vehicle, it was a signal. To the locals who lived in the poverty-stricken shadows of the tourist trail, it represented wealth, it represented opportunity. And for one specific group of people, it represented a shopping list of parts that could be harvested and sold. The men had set up camp near a place called Punta San Jose, a remote stretch of coastline south of Ensenada. It is a beautiful spot, accessible only by dirt roads that wind through the scrub. It is the kind of place you go to escape civilization, to be alone with the wind and the sea. They pitched their tents, built a fire, and settled in for the night, lulled by the rhythmic crashing of the waves. They were far from the city, far from help, wrapped in the illusion of solitude. But they were not alone. They had been spotted earlier that day at a beach near Ensenada. Among the locals who had taken notice of the three tall, athletic tourists was a 23-year-old woman named Ari Giselle. She was there with her boyfriend, a man known on the streets as El Quecas, a slang term for quesadilla. His real name was Jesus Gerardo, a man with a history of violence and a moral compass that pointed only toward his own immediate desires. As the surfers waxed their boards and laughed in the sunshine, Ari Giselle's eyes were not on their faces or their athletic prowess. Her eyes were fixed on their truck, specifically on the tires. They were all-terrain tires, thick and rugged, designed to handle the rough roads of the peninsula. In that region, good tires are a valuable commodity. They are expensive, hard to come by, and easy to sell. In a moment that illustrates the terrifying banality of evil, a thought formed in Ari Giselle's mind. It was not a grand plan of criminal mastermind. It was a simple, selfish want. She turned to her boyfriend, Jesus Gerardo, and made a request that would ultimately cost three men their lives. She told him she wanted those tires for her own pickup truck. She also mentioned that she wanted a good phone. It was a shopping list delivered with the casualness of asking for a soda. "Bring me a good phone and good tires for my pickup truck," she reportedly said. It was a sentence that sealed the fate of Jake, Callum, and Carter. To Ari and Jesus, the men in the white truck were not doctors or athletes or fiancés. They were merely obstacles standing between Ari and a new set of tires. They were dehumanized, reduced to the owners of objects that someone else wanted. Jesus' Gerardo did not hesitate. The request from his girlfriend was a directive he was all too willing to fulfill. He gathered 2 accomplices, men known as Ireneo Francisco and Angel Jesus. Together, the 3 of them set out to track down the white Chevrolet Colorado. They followed the surfer's trail, moving like wolves, stalking a herd of deer, waiting for the moment when the prey would be most vulnerable. They found the surfers at their campsite near Santo Tomas. The sun had gone down, and the area was shrouded in darkness, lit only by the dying embers of the campfire and the vast canopy of stars overhead. The isolation that the surfers had sought was now their greatest liability. There were no police patrols here, no neighbors to hear a scream, no security cameras to witness what was about to happen. The attackers moved in under the cover of night. They were armed and they had the element of surprise. Jake, Callum, and Carter were likely relaxing, perhaps winding down after a day in the water, recounting the best rides of the afternoon. The sudden appearance of armed men in the firelight would have been a jarring, surreal interruption to their peace. The demand was likely shouted in Spanish, a language they may have struggled to understand in the panic of the moment. The men wanted the truck, they wanted the tires, they wanted the phones. But robbery is a volatile crime. It relies on fear and compliance, and when you are dealing with 3 strong, athletic men who are confused and terrified, things can spiral out of control in a heartbeat. We may never know the exact sequence of events that followed. Did one of the surfers try to resist? Did they try to reason with the gunman? Did they simply hesitate too long? What we do know is that the robbery turned into an execution. The quiet of the coastal night was shattered by the crack of gunfire. 3 shots rang out, echoing off the cliffs and being swallowed by the sound of the surf. Jake Robinson, Callum Robinson, and Jack Carter Road were each shot in the head. It was cold, efficient, and final. In an instant, the doctor, the athlete, and the entrepreneur were gone. The violence did not end with the pulling of the trigger. The attackers now had 3 bodies and a crime scene to clean up. They were not panicked, they were methodical. They dragged the lifeless bodies of the 3 friends to the back of the pickup truck, the very truck they had come to steal. But now, the truck was evidence. The plan to steal the tires had been overtaken by the need to cover up a triple homicide. They drove the truck, laden with the dead, away from the campsite. They traveled approximately 4 miles through the darkness to a location that was even more remote, a place known to the locals for its hidden dangers. There, concealed in the scrub brush, was a deep well. It was an open shaft plunging 50 feet down into the earth, a dark throat waiting to swallow the secrets of the cartel-controlled hinterlands. One by one, the killers lifted the bodies of Jake, Callum, and Carter and threw them into the abyss. They tumbled down into the darkness, landing in the stagnant water and mud at the bottom. But as the bodies fell, they landed on something else. The well was already occupied. There was another body down there, a victim of a completely unrelated crime who had been rotting in the dark for weeks or months. The surfers were simply the latest additions to this vertical graveyard. With the bodies disposed of, the killers turned their attention to the truck. They drove it to another location and set it on fire. The flames consumed the white paint, the camping gear, and the memories of the trip. The tires, the very objects that had sparked this nightmare, melted into pools of black, toxic sludge. The metal frame twisted and blackened, a charred skeleton left to rust in the desert sun. Back in the United States and Australia, a different kind of nightmare was beginning. The daily social media posts had stopped. The text messages ceased. The phones went straight to voicemail. At first, friends and family rationalized it. They were camping in a remote area. Cell service was spotty. They were just enjoying the moment. But as the hours turned into days, the silence grew heavier. It transformed from a minor worry into a suffocating dread. By April 29th, the panic had set in. Families thousands of miles away began making frantic calls to authorities. The FBI was notified, recognizing that American citizens were missing on foreign soil. The Australian consulate was alerted. A massive search operation was launched, spanning 2 continents. Flyers were posted online, shared by thousands of people in the surfing community who felt a kinship with the missing men. Mexican authorities, under immense pressure from the international community, began to scour the coastline. They checked hospitals, jails, and campsites. They interviewed locals and traced the route the men had taken. On May 1st, 4 days after the disappearance, a routine patrol in Ensenada caught a break. Police officers stopped a young woman who was acting suspiciously. She tried to run when she saw them, tossing aside a bag. The police caught her and retrieved the bag. Inside, they found a stash of drugs, but more importantly, they found a mobile phone. When they powered it up, the screen lit up with a photo that did not belong to her. It was the phone of one of the missing surfers. The woman was Ari Giselle. The thread that would unravel the entire crime had been pulled. Under interrogation, Ari Giselle's composure crumbled. She began to talk. She told the police a story that was sickening in its simplicity. She recounted how her boyfriend, Jesus Gerardo, had come to her house on April 28th, the day after the surfers vanished. He had been driving his own truck, but it was sporting a brand new set of all-terrain tires. When she asked him about the tires, he didn't lie. He didn't make up a story about buying them. He looked at her and confessed with a chilling lack of remorse. He told her he had harmed 3 gringos. When she pressed him for details, asking what he meant by harmed, he clarified. "I killed them," he said. He showed her the tires as if they were a trophy, a gift he had procured for her. Ari Giselle, rather than going to the police, had accepted the phone he gave her. She had become an accessory to the crime, bound to the killers by her silence and her greed. But now, facing prison, she gave up everything. She led the police to the location of the well. She gave them the names of the accomplices. She provided the roadmap to the bodies. On May 3rd, rescue teams arrived at the well near Santo Tomas. It was a grim operation. The shaft was narrow and unstable, the air rising from it thick with the smell of decay. Using ropes and pulley systems, specialized teams descended into the darkness. It took hours to retrieve the bodies. When they were finally brought to the surface, the devastation was total. The families of Jake and Callum Robinson traveled from Australia to Mexico for the identification process. It is a journey no parent should ever have to make. They walked into the morgue, a sterile, cold room that smelled of antiseptic and death, to look at the faces of their sons. They didn't need DNA tests. They didn't need dental records. They knew their boys. They recognized the faces they had kissed goodnight 1,000 times. The confirmation sent a shockwave of grief across the world. In Perth, the community rallied around the Robinson family. In San Diego, the friends of Carter Road gathered to mourn the man who would never make it to his wedding day. Tributes poured in, painting a picture of 3 men who were loved, respected, and full of light. They were the best of us, taken by the worst of us. The legal proceedings began in Ensenada. Jesus Gerardo, Ireneo Francisco, and Angel Jesus were arrested and charged with aggravated homicide, robbery, and grand theft auto. The prosecutor described the crime as a useless act of violence, a killing for parts. Ari Giselle, the woman who started it all, became the star witness against her former boyfriend. She stood in court, a woman who had traded 3 lives for a set of rubber tires, and testified about the confession. She spoke of how Jesus had bragged about the killings. But the law did not let her off the hook. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison for her role in the robbery and for inciting the violence. It was a heavy sentence, but it felt light compared to the loss of 3 lives. During the sentencing hearing, the parents of the Robinson brothers addressed the court via video link. Their words were not filled with vengeance, but with a profound, bewildered sorrow. Martin Robinson, the father, spoke directly to Ari Giselle. "I could never understand why you had to rob these young men," he said. It was the question that hung over the entire case. Why? His wife, Deborah, described the silence in their home. "The grief is constant," she said. "We were proud of them because they were kind, generous, compassionate, and happy. We dreamed of seeing them grow older, of having children. That is all taken now." It was a statement that captured the ripple effect of murder. It doesn't just kill the victim, it kills the future of everyone who loved them. But in the midst of this darkness, Martin Robinson offered a directive to the world. He urged people to live bigger, shine brighter, and love harder in memory of his sons. It was a defiance of the nihilism that had taken them. It was a refusal to let the ugliness of their deaths overshadow the beauty of their lives. The well near Santo Tomas remains there, a scar in the earth. The waves still crash against the shore of Baja California, rolling in with the same indifference they showed on the night of the murders. The surf trip that was supposed to be a celebration of life became a cautionary tale about the randomness of violence. We often think of danger as a monster, something recognizable and monstrous. But sometimes, the monster is just a person who wants a new set of tires and doesn't care who has to die to get them. The scariest thing about this story isn't the cartel, or the guns, or the dark well. It is the absolute, casual disregard for human life. It is the idea that your existence is worth less than a piece of automotive equipment. As the rain continues to fall outside your window, let this story settle in your mind. It is a reminder to cherish every road trip, every sunset, every wave, because you never know when the road ends. You never know when the music stops. And you never know who is watching from the shadows, calculating the value of your life against the price of your possessions. The rain continues to fall, a relentless curtain of water that blurs the edges of the world outside. It washes away the salt and sand of the Mexican coast, replacing the heat with a damp, penetrating chill. We are moving now from the blinding sun to the gray, flat horizons of the English fens. Listen to the sound of the rain deepening, becoming heavier, soaking into the earth. It is the sound of secrets being buried in the mud, waiting for the slow passage of time to reveal them. Our next story takes us to the market town of Wisbech, located in the county of Cambridgeshire, England. It is a place where the sky seems huge, stretching over flat agricultural lands that were once submerged by the sea. The wind here blows unobstructed, carrying the scent of wet earth and history. It is a quiet community, the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, and the rhythm of life is dictated by the seasons and the postman's daily rounds. In January 2013, this town was the home of a woman named Una Crown. At 86 years old, Una was a fixture of the community. She was a retired postmistress, a woman who had spent decades serving the public, handling their letters and parcels with efficiency and care. She was part of the generation that had lived through the Second World War, a generation defined by resilience, stoicism, and a deep sense of propriety. Una lived alone in a bungalow on Magazine Lane, a tidy residential street lined with similar homes. She had been a widow for 4 years, living independently despite her advanced age. She was a slight woman, physically frail in the way that octogenarians often are, but her spirit remained sharp. She was active, engaged, and surrounded by a network of family and friends who cared for her deeply. She was not a woman who lived in the shadows, she was loved. Her niece, Judith Payne, and Judith's husband John lived nearby and were constant presences in her life. They had a routine that anchored Una's week. On Sundays, they would collect her for lunch, a simple act of family bonding that ensured she was eating well and provided a regular check-in on her welfare. It was a safety net woven from love, the kind of arrangement that allows an elderly person to maintain their dignity and independence while knowing that help is never far away. But safety is often an illusion, a fragile construct that can be shattered by the person living just a few doors down. Living on a nearby street called Magazine Close was a man named David Newton. He was in his late 50s, a kitchen fitter and handyman who had integrated himself into the lives of the elderly residents in the area. He presented himself as a helpful neighbor, the kind of man you could call if a shelf needed fixing or a door was sticking. Newton had done work for Una in the past. Specifically, he had helped her with a lock on her back door. To Una, this was likely a mundane transaction, a trusted local tradesman fixing a security issue to keep her safe. But to Newton, it was an opportunity for betrayal. When he had access to that lock, he had secretly made a copy of her back door key. He didn't hand it over. He kept it. This key was a weapon. It transformed the lock from a barrier into a private entrance for a predator. It meant that no matter how careful Una was, no matter how many times she checked her doors before bed, she was never truly secure. The man who had fixed the lock held the power to bypass it whenever he chose. It was a violation of trust so profound that it chills the blood to think about it. The person you pay to protect you is the one who leaves the gate open. David Newton had a disturbing pattern of behavior that went unnoticed or was dismissed as mere eccentricity until it was too late. He had a habit of entering people's homes uninvited. He would walk in, sit down, and impose his company on neighbors who were often too polite or too intimidated to ask him to leave. He was a boundary crosser, a man who did not respect the sanctity of another person's private space. On the evening of Saturday, January 12, 2013, Newton was drinking heavily. Alcohol often acted as a fuel for his intrusive tendencies. He had been making nuisance phone calls to elderly women that night, pestering them, looking for attention in all the wrong ways. His inhibitions were lowered, his judgment impaired. Somewhere in the haze of intoxication, his thoughts turned to the bungalow on Magazine Lane and the woman who lived there alone. Una Crown had spent that Saturday following her usual quiet routine. She had spoken to a friend on the telephone around 5 in the afternoon. It was a normal conversation, filled with the small details of daily life. There was no fear in her voice, no sense of impending doom. She hung up the phone, perhaps made herself a cup of tea, and settled in for the evening. She had no way of knowing that her timeline was running out. Sometime after that call, under the cover of darkness, David Newton left his home and walked the short distance to Una's bungalow. He didn't knock, he didn't ring the bell. He went to the back door, the very door he had worked on, and inserted the stolen key. The lock turned silently. He opened the door and stepped into the warmth of Una's home. He was an intruder, a ghost entering a sanctuary where he had no right to be. We can only imagine the moment Una realized she was not alone. Perhaps she heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. Perhaps she felt a draft of cold air. When she confronted him, the situation escalated with terrifying speed. Evidence found later suggested that Una had tried to use her telephone, perhaps attempting to dial for help when she saw the man standing in her hallway. Whether she recognized him as the handyman or saw him only as a threat, the result was the same. Newton reacted with savage violence. He grabbed a knife from Una's own kitchen, turning a domestic tool into a murder weapon. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a frenzied, brutal assault on a defenseless elderly woman. Una, despite her age and frailty, tried to fight back. She raised her hands to protect herself, a natural, desperate instinct. In the struggle, her fingernails scraped against her attacker's skin. It was a futile physical defense against a younger, stronger man, but in that act of resistance, she captured the only evidence that would eventually matter. She trapped his DNA beneath her nails, a microscopic accusation that she would carry with her into death. Newton slashed her throat. The wound was deep and fatal, but the violence did not stop there. He stabbed her 4 times in the chest with such force that one of the blows passed completely through her body, entering her chest and exiting her back. It was a level of overkill that speaks to a deep, uncontrolled rage. Una collapsed in her hallway, surrounded by her own blood, her life ending in terror and pain. With Una dead, Newton began a clumsy attempt to cover his tracks. He knew he had left evidence. He knew the scene was a map of his crime. He decided to burn it all. He gathered newspapers and piled them around the body. He set 3 separate fires inside the bungalow. He even set fire to Una's body, trying to incinerate the physical traces of his attack. He burned her clothes. The flames licked at her skin, charring her left hand completely. But fire is unpredictable. The windows were closed, the oxygen was limited, and Newton was not an expert arsonist. The fires smoldered and died out before they could consume the house. Crucially, they failed to destroy Una's right hand, the hand that had scratched him, the hand that held the key to solving the murder. Before he left, Newton indulged in a final act of callous theft. He pulled the wedding ring from Una's finger, stealing the symbol of her marriage to her late husband. He rifled through her handbag and took 40 pounds in cash. He also took her front door key, locking the door behind him as he left, perhaps to make it look like a burglary committed by a stranger. The next day, Sunday, January 13th, was a day of surreal contrast. While Una lay dead in her hallway, her body partially burned and surrounded by blood, David Newton was out in the town enjoying himself. He went to the local servicemen's club, not once but twice. He played the fruit machines, spending the money he had likely stolen from the woman he had just butchered. He acted as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking toward discovery. John Payne, Una's nephew-in-law, arrived at the bungalow to pick her up for Sunday lunch as planned. He rang the bell. Silence. He knocked. No answer. This was unlike Una. She was reliable. Worry began to gnaw at him. He eventually gained access to the house, and the sight that greeted him was the stuff of nightmares. He found Una lying in the hallway. The smell of smoke hung in the stagnant air. The blood was dry and dark. He saw the burnt newspapers and the charred state of her clothing. He immediately called the emergency services. Police, firefighters, and paramedics rushed to the scene on Magazine Lane. This should have been the moment the investigation began in earnest. The crime scene should have been sealed, the forensics team summoned. Instead, what happened next was a catastrophic failure of policing. The officers who arrived at the scene looked at the body of a woman with a slashed throat and stab wounds, surrounded by burnt newspapers, and they made an incomprehensible decision. They decided the death was not suspicious. They classified it as unexplained. They somehow reasoned that she might have had an accident with a towel and the cooker, and panic had ensued. Because of this decision, the bungalow was not treated as a crime scene. It was a thoroughfare. Police officers walked through the blood, paramedics moved items, firefighters checked the building. Even the undertakers were called in to remove the body just hours after the discovery. People touched surfaces, opened doors, and trampled over potential evidence. The sanctity of the scene was destroyed. It was a level of incompetence that borders on negligence. For 2 full days, the police operated under the belief that this was a tragic accident. It wasn't until Tuesday, January 15th, that the truth was forced upon them. A post-mortem examination was scheduled. When the mortuary staff began to undress Una, they saw the undeniable reality of her injuries. They saw the slash across her neck, They saw the stab wounds in her chest. The pathology report was unequivocal. This was murder. The investigation was immediately upgraded, but the damage had been done. The golden hour, that critical period immediately after a crime is discovered, had been lost. It had stretched into 48 hours of lost time. The killer had been given a 2-day head start to wash his clothes, clean his shoes, and compose himself. Detectives scrambled to recover. They launched a murder inquiry, but they were working backward from a compromised position. They interviewed neighbors, including David Newton. He told them he hadn't seen Una. He played the innocent neighbor. Without forensic evidence linking him to the scene, evidence that might have been destroyed by the police trampling through the house, they couldn't pin it on him. He was arrested weeks later on suspicion, questioned, and released. There simply wasn't enough to charge him. He walked free. He returned to his home on Magazine Close, living his life just streets away from where he had taken Una's. For Una's family, this was a torture without end. They knew she had been murdered. They knew the investigation had been botched. And they watched the years tick by with no justice. The case went cold. It sat in the archives, a testament to failure. But science does not stand still. While the case gathered dust, DNA technology was advancing at an exponential rate. Techniques that didn't exist in 2013 were becoming standard practice by the next decade. In October 2022, the Cambridgeshire police decided to take another look. They turned their attention to the fingernail clippings that had been taken from Una's right hand during the autopsy. That hand, the one that had survived the fire, held the secret. Forensic scientists used new, sensitive methods to analyze the debris trapped beneath the nails. They were looking for the tiniest fragment of a genetic profile that didn't belong to Una. And they found it. They found a clear male DNA profile. When they ran it against the database, it didn't come back as an unknown. It came back as a match to David Newton. The helpful handyman, the neighbor, the man who had copied the key. It was the smoking gun that had been waiting in the evidence locker for nearly 10 years. This evidence shattered Newton's defense. He had claimed he hadn't seen Una. He claimed he had no physical contact with her. But his DNA under her fingernails told a different story. It placed him right there, in close, violent contact with her as she fought for her life. It proved that her final act of resistance had been the one that would eventually condemn him. In April 2024, police arrested David Newton for the second time. He was 69 years old now, having lived almost a dozen years of freedom he didn't deserve. This time, he didn't walk away. He was charged with murder. The trial began in January 2025, 12 years after the crime. The prosecutor laid out the case, weaving together the new DNA evidence with the circumstantial details that had always pointed to Newton. The stolen money, the copied key, the timeline, the heavy drinking. Newton tried to deny it, but the science was irrefutable. The jury listened to the tragic sequence of errors that had delayed justice, but they focused on the biological truth that had finally emerged. On February 13, 2025, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty. David Newton, the man who had preyed on the vulnerable and hidden in plain sight, was finally held accountable. The following day, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. At 70 years of age, he will almost certainly die in prison. The judge, Justice Neil Garnham, did not mince words. He described the attack as ferocious and sustained. He acknowledged the terror Una must have felt in her final moments, betrayed by someone she knew, violated in the sanctuary of her own home. It was a condemnation of a cowardly act committed against a woman who deserved nothing but respect and peace. The story of Una Crown is a tragedy of errors, but it is also a triumph of persistence. It reminds us that while justice can be delayed, and while investigations can be flawed, the truth has a way of surviving. It survived the fire, it survived the cleaning crews, it survived the passage of time. It held on, tight and microscopic, beneath the fingernails of a brave woman who refused to go gently into the dark. As the rain drums against the roof, let us remember Una, not as a victim of a botched investigation, but as the woman who caught her own killer. She held on to him for 10 years until the world was smart enough to hear what she was saying, and in the end, her grip was strong enough to drag him from his home and put him behind bars where he belongs. The flatlands of Wisbech are quiet again. The wind still blows across the fens, but the shadow that hung over Magazine Lane has finally been lifted. The helpful handyman is gone, and the secrets of that January night have been brought into the cold, hard light of day. The rain outside shifts its tempo now. It grows colder, harder, transforming from a gentle patter into a stinging sleet that rattles against the glass. The English dampness fades, replaced by a biting Arctic wind that howls across vast, frozen distances. We are leaving the flatlands of Cambridgeshire and traveling thousands of miles northwest to the edge of the habitable world. We are going to Alaska. This is a place where the landscape is so immense it defies comprehension. 600,000 square miles of mountains, forests, and tundra. A place where nature is beautiful, but indifferent to human survival. In this land of midnight sun and endless winter, the distances between people can be vast, but sometimes the greatest danger is not the bear in the woods or the cold in the air. Sometimes the danger lives right on the other side of your fence. The year is 2007. The setting is Anchorage, the urban heart of the state. It is a city that sits like an island of civilization in a sea of wilderness. For Mindy Schloss, this city was home. Mindy was 52 years old, a woman defined by her compassion and her unshakable reliability. She was a nurse practitioner, a role that requires not just medical skill, but a profound dedication to the well-being of others. Mindy worked in Fairbanks, the state's second-largest city, located more than 300 miles to the north. It was a grueling commute, one that required her to work long rotations away from home. But she did it without complaint. She was the kind of person who showed up. If Mindy said she would be there, she was there. Her friends and colleagues knew her as a rock, a steady presence in a profession that is often chaotic and demanding. Her home in the Sand Lake neighborhood of Anchorage was her sanctuary. It was the place where she could decompress after days of caring for the sick. It was a space of order and peace, a reflection of her own disciplined life. She lived alone, enjoying the independence she had earned. But in 2007, the dynamic of her quiet street changed. A new neighbor moved into the house next door. His name was Joshua Allen Wade. To the casual observer, he was just a young man, 27 years old, trying to make a fresh start. He seemed ordinary enough, blending into the suburban rhythm of the neighborhood, but appearances in Alaska can be deceiving. The snow covers many things, and a polite smile can hide a soul that has been twisted beyond recognition. Mindy had no idea who was watching her from across the property line. Joshua Wade was not a man looking for redemption. He was a predator who had slipped through the cracks of a broken justice system. His history was a roadmap of violence that had begun when he was just a child. In 1994, at the age of 14, he had killed a man named John Michael Martin. He had gotten away with it. 5 years later, he killed another man, Henry Ongtoas, in a motel room. Again, he walked free, a ghost in the system. But it was the year 2000 that should have been the end of his freedom. Wade was accused of murdering a woman named Della Brown. Her body was found in a shed, and the evidence pointed to him. But the case was mishandled. The prosecution fumbled. Instead of a murder conviction, Wade was found guilty only of witness tampering. The system blinked. Instead of locking him away for life, they gave him a sentence measured in years. He served his time. He sat in a cell, not reforming, but waiting. And when he was released in 2007, the system declared him free. He had paid his debt for the witness tampering, and the murder charge was gone. He moved into the house next to Mindy Schloss, a wolf given permission to live among the sheep. He was a ticking time bomb, and the countdown was almost over. Friday, August 3rd, 2007. It began as a typical day for Mindy. She was at home, enjoying the respite between her work shifts in Fairbanks. Perhaps she was reading, or tending to her house, enjoying the simple pleasure of her own space. She felt safe. Why wouldn't she? She was in her own home, in a good neighborhood, surrounded by the familiar comforts of her life. Next door, Joshua Wade was having a bad day. It is terrifying to think that a bad mood in a violent man can be the catalyst for tragedy, but that is the reality of psychopathy. Something had gone wrong at work or in his personal life, and a dark rage was building inside him. He needed an outlet. He needed to exert control. And he looked at the house next door and saw an opportunity. Mindy was a professional. She had a job, a car, a bank account. To Wade, she wasn't a neighbor or a nurse. She was a resource. He decided he would rob her. The plan was impulsive, driven by anger and greed, but executed with the cold precision of an experienced killer. As the evening light began to fade, casting long shadows across the street, Wade crossed the line between his property and hers. He entered her home. The violation of that moment is hard to overstate. 1 minute, you are safe in your living room. The next, a nightmare is standing in front of you. Wade was younger, stronger, and armed with the element of surprise. He overpowered Mindy. He used zip ties to bind her hands, stripping away her ability to fight back. He reduced a capable, independent woman to a captive in her own house. He demanded her financial information. He wanted her ATM card. He wanted her PIN. Mindy, terrified and likely believing that cooperation was her only path to survival, gave him what he asked for. She probably thought that if she just gave him the money, he would leave. She would call the police, cancel the cards, and put this horror behind her. But Wade had seen her face. She knew who he was. He couldn't leave a witness, not with his record, not with the fragile freedom he had just regained. The robbery had to become a murder. He forced Mindy out of her house and into her own car, a red Acura Integra. Imagine the terror of that walk to the car, the realization that he wasn't leaving, the realization that you are being taken away from the only safety you know. Wade got behind the wheel of her car. Mindy was in the passenger seat, or the back, bound and helpless. He drove them away from the lights of the neighborhood, heading north toward the highway. They drove out of Anchorage, past the strip malls and the suburbs, into the encroaching darkness of the Alaskan wilderness. They headed toward Wasilla, a town about 40 miles away. The drive would have taken close to an hour. An hour of silence, or perhaps threats. An hour for Mindy to watch the familiar landmarks pass by, knowing that each mile was taking her further from help. Wade turned off the main road, guiding the Acura onto a quiet, isolated track surrounded by dense woods. This was not a random spot. This was a place chosen for its obscurity. He stopped the car. The silence of the woods would have been deafening. No traffic noise, no neighbors, just the wind in the trees. He forced Mindy out of the vehicle. At gunpoint, he marched her into the forest. The ground would have been uneven, the undergrowth thick. She walked because she had no choice, her hands bound, a gun pointed at her back. Deep in the woods, Wade stopped. He raised his Glock pistol. He didn't hesitate. He shot Mindy in the back of the head. It was an execution, a cowardly act committed against a defenseless woman. Mindy Schloss, the healer, the friend, the nurse, died alone in the dirt, miles from the people who loved her. But Wade wasn't finished. He had killed her, but now he needed to erase her. He gathered flammable materials and set fire to her body. He tried to burn away the evidence of his crime, to turn a human being into ash and bone that the forest would swallow. He watched the flames for a moment, then turned his back and walked away. He got back into her car and drove back to the city, leaving her burning in the wilderness. The next few days revealed the true depth of Wade's sociopathy. He didn't flee. He didn't hide. He went back to his life. He used Mindy's ATM card to withdraw cash from her account. He was caught on security cameras, a man in a mask or hiding his face, methodically draining the account of the woman he had just murdered. He spent her money on mundane things, living off the proceeds of her death. He needed to get rid of the car. He drove the red Acura to the Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport and left it in the long-term parking lot. It was a clever move. A car at an airport implies a trip, a voluntary departure. It was designed to buy him time, to make people think Mindy had simply gone away for a while. Then he went home, back to the house next door, to the empty, silent home of his victim. But Mindy was reliable. Her absence was a siren that could not be ignored. On August 7th, 4 days after the murder, a friend realized something was wrong. Mindy hadn't shown up for work in Fairbanks. She wasn't answering her phone. This was impossible. Mindy never missed a shift. The friend called the police and asked for a welfare check. Officers arrived at the house on Sand Lake. They found a scene that confirmed the worst fears. The house was in chaos. Furniture was overturned. Items were scattered. It was the aftermath of a struggle. The red Acura was gone. It was clear that Mindy hadn't left for a vacation. She had been taken. The investigation began immediately. Detectives found the ATM transactions. They watched the grainy footage of the man taking the money. They found the car at the airport. They processed it for DNA, swabbing every surface, looking for the ghost in the machine. But they still didn't have a body. Without a body, a murder charge is incredibly difficult to prove. They knew she was gone, but they couldn't prove she was dead. The breakthrough came from the laboratory. The DNA found inside Mindy's car was processed. It wasn't a mystery sample. It matched a profile that was already in the system. Joshua Allen Wade, the neighbor, the man who had been let off for the murder of Della Brown. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. He had been right there the whole time. But where was Mindy? Wade wasn't talking. He sat in the interrogation room, arrogant and silent. He knew the game. He knew that without a body, they were stuck. For over a month, the police searched, and the family waited in agony. Then, on September 13th, a municipal worker in the woods near Wasilla found something. Human remains, partially burned, hidden in the undergrowth. Dental records confirmed it was Mindy. Now, it wasn't a missing person case. It was a homicide. Wade was arrested. But this time, the dynamic was different. Because he had used the car in the commission of the crime, federal authorities got involved. Carjacking resulting in death is a federal crime. And unlike the state of Alaska, the federal government has the death penalty. Wade was facing lethal injection. The arrogance evaporated. Faced with the prospect of his own death, he suddenly became willing to talk. He cut a deal. To save his own life, he would plead guilty. He would admit to killing Mindy Schloss. He would accept a sentence of life in prison without parole. He would die in a cage, but he would not be executed. But the deal had a second part. He had to come clean. He had to clear the books. Wade admitted to the murder of Della Brown, the crime he had beaten years earlier. He admitted to killing John Michael Martin when he was 14. He admitted to killing Henry Ongtoas. He admitted to killing an unidentified man. 5 murders. 5 lives stolen by one man who the system had failed to stop. In court, Wade tried to apologize. He offered hollow words to the families, but the mask slipped. He got into an angry exchange with the judge, showing the rage that still simmered just below the surface. He was sent away to a federal prison in Indiana, far from the Alaska he had terrorized. He spent the next 17 years in a cell. On June 14, 2024, Joshua Wade died in prison. He was 44 years old. The cause of death was not disclosed, but his death closed the book on a dark chapter of Alaskan history. But it does not erase the pain. It does not bring back Mindy Schloss. Mindy's story is a tragedy of proximity. She did everything right. She worked hard. She was kind. She was careful. But she lived next door to a monster who had been let out of his cage too soon. It forces us to ask the uncomfortable question: how well do we really know the people who live on the other side of the fence? We wave to them. We take in their mail. But we don't know what they are capable of when the curtains are drawn and the rage takes over. Outside, the wind is picking up, howling like a wolf in the distance. The snow is piling up against the glass. It is a cold night, the kind of night where you want to double-check the lock on your front door. Do it now. Make sure you are safe. Because the next story takes us from the known danger of a neighbor to the baffling mystery of a woman who simply turned around. The rain beats against the roof, a relentless drumbeat that echoes the pounding of the waves against a cold, gray shore. The wind howls, carrying with it the salt spray of the North Atlantic, chilling the air until it bites at exposed skin. We are leaving the dark forests of Alaska and crossing the ocean to the rugged coast of Scotland. Here, in the ancient town of Prestwick, the sea holds secrets that refuse to stay buried, and the truth is as elusive as a shadow in the fog. The year is 2005. It is December, a time when the Scottish days are short and the darkness arrives in the mid-afternoon. The festive season is approaching, and the air should be filled with anticipation and joy. But in the coastal town of Prestwick, a shadow is about to fall. This is a story about a journey that was interrupted, a life that was cut short, and a mystery that has haunted two nations for nearly 2 decades. Annie Christina Borgeson was 30 years old, a woman who radiated life and energy. Her friends called her the Viking Princess because of her long, thick blonde hair and her striking presence. She was a Swedish national who had made Scotland her home for the past year, living in Edinburgh and immersing herself in the culture. Annie was not a drifter. She was a talented linguist who spoke multiple languages fluently. She was a musician who loved to dance. She was vibrant. She had spent most of 2005 in Edinburgh, working in the tourism industry and making friends who adored her. But as December approached, her thoughts turned to home. She missed her family in Sweden. She missed her mother, Guje. She had made plans to return to Sweden for Christmas, a trip she had been looking forward to for months. Everything was arranged. Her bag was packed. Her passport was ready. Annie was the definition of organized. Before leaving Edinburgh, she had paid her rent in advance for the month of January, ensuring she had a home to return to. She had booked a hair appointment back in Sweden, a mundane detail that speaks volumes about her state of mind. People who are planning to end their lives rarely worry about their hairstyles or next month's rent. Annie was planning for a future, not a funeral. On Friday, December 2nd, Annie visited her friend Kat Dalmo at work. It was a casual visit, a chance to catch up before she left for the airport the next day. Kat later described Annie as being in good spirits. There was no sign of depression, no hint of the darkness that would soon consume her. Annie stepped away to make a private phone call during the visit, but when she returned, she was her usual self. The next day, Saturday, December 3rd, Annie left her flat in Edinburgh. She carried her travel bag, packed with her clothes, her wallet, and her passport. She made the journey across the country to Prestwick Airport, located on the west coast of Scotland, about 80 miles away. Prestwick is a hub for budget airlines, a busy gateway for travelers heading to Europe. Annie had a ticket for an evening flight to Sweden. She arrived at the airport in the mid-afternoon. At 14 minutes past 3, the CCTV cameras captured her entering the terminal building. The grainy footage shows a woman walking with purpose, her bag slung over her shoulder. She looks like any other traveler, focused on her destination. She walks through the automatic doors and into the main concourse. But then, something inexplicable happens. Annie spends less than 5 minutes inside the terminal. She does not go to the check-in desk. She does not go through security. She does not buy a coffee or sit down to wait. Instead, she stops, she turns around, and she walks back out the way she came. The cameras capture her exit, a solitary figure walking away from her flight, away from her family, and away from safety. What happened in those 4 or 5 minutes? Did she see someone? Did she receive a message? Did she realize she had forgotten something? Or was she gripped by a sudden, overwhelming fear? We will never know what went through her mind in that short window of time. All we know is that she walked out of the airport and into the oblivion of the Scottish winter. That CCTV footage is the last confirmed sighting of Annie Borgeson alive. The next morning, Sunday, December 4th, a dog walker was strolling along Prestwick Beach, about a mile from the airport. The beach is a desolate place in winter, a sweep of gray sand battered by the wind and the waves. It is not a place for leisurely walks, but for bracing against the elements. As the walker moved along the shoreline, they saw a shape lying on the sand near the water's edge. It was a body. It was Annie. She was lying face down in the wet sand, the cold tide lapping at her clothes. But it was not just her body that was found. Nearby, lying on the beach as if placed there, was her travel bag. Inside were her passport, her wallet, and her clothes. It was a tableau that looked almost staged, a collection of a life scattered on the shore. When the police arrived, they looked at the scene and made a decision that would spark controversy for years to come. Detective Michael Neal, who was on duty, later stated that there was nothing to indicate any criminality. The police decided, almost immediately, that this was a tragic case of suicide. They theorized that Annie, despite her happy demeanor and her future plans, had walked into the icy sea and drowned herself. This conclusion was reached with breathtaking speed. Before a full investigation had been conducted, before forensic tests were complete, the narrative was set. The police informed the Swedish authorities that they suspected suicide. They told Annie's devastated family that their daughter had taken her own life. It was a brutal, final explanation that shattered her mother's heart. But it didn't make sense. 3 days after the discovery, a post-mortem examination was conducted in Scotland. The pathologist's report was consistent with the police theory. It stated that the cause of death was drowning. Crucially, it noted that there were no signs of trauma on Annie's body. No bruises, no cuts, no defensive wounds. It painted a picture of a peaceful, if tragic, end, a woman who simply walked into the water and let it take her. But the story does not end there. In fact, this is where the nightmare truly begins. Annie's body was released to her family for burial in Sweden. But first, it had to be transported. The body was flown to London, where it was received by a funeral company responsible for preparing it for the final leg of the journey. When the staff at the London funeral home opened the body bag, they were disturbed by what they saw. They did not see the pristine, unmarked body described in the Scottish autopsy report. They saw bruising, heavy, significant bruising on her body. It was severe enough that they felt compelled to document it and raise concerns. How could a body that was supposedly unmarked 3 days earlier now be covered in bruises? Bruises do not form after death. They are the result of trauma inflicted while the heart is still beating. The body continued its journey to Sweden. There it was received by Gunn Daneberg, an undertaker with nearly 40 years of experience. Gunn had seen everything. She had prepared thousands of bodies for burial. But when she saw Annie, she was shocked. What she saw would stay with her for the rest of her life, a haunting image that she could never unsee. Gunn observed the bruising that the London staff had seen. But she saw something else, something even more chilling. On Annie's neck, she saw distinct finger marks, two deep, dark bruises that looked exactly like the impression of a hand. To an experienced eye, they screamed one thing: strangulation. Someone had gripped Annie's neck with force. Gunn also noticed that Annie's long, beautiful blonde hair had been hacked off. It was uneven, jagged, as if cut in a hurry or in a struggle. The autopsy report had made no mention of this. It had made no mention of the finger marks. It had made no mention of the bruising. The official document described a body that simply did not match the one lying in the coffin in Sweden. The discrepancies were impossible to ignore. Annie's family, led by her mother Guje and her best friend Maria, began to ask questions. They demanded answers from the Scottish authorities. Why was the autopsy report so different from the physical reality? How could trained pathologists miss strangulation marks? Why was the conclusion of suicide reached so quickly? The family commissioned their own experts to look at the evidence. They looked at the bag found on the beach. The police theory was that Annie had walked into the water carrying her bag, drowned, and then washed up. But the sea at Prestwick is rough. The currents are strong. Experts argued that if she had been in the water with the bag, they would have separated. The heavy bag would have sunk or been dragged away. To test this, the family's investigators conducted experiments. They threw a dummy and a similar bag into the sea at the location where Annie supposedly entered. The items did wash up, but they washed up separately, scattered by the tide. They did not land neatly beside each other. The scene on the beach looked less like the aftermath of a drowning and more like a body and evidence that had been dumped. Then came the microscopic evidence. Samples taken from Annie's body were analyzed for diatoms, microscopic algae found in water. If a person drowns, they inhale water, and these diatoms enter the bloodstream and organs. The type of diatoms found can tell you where the person drowned. Prestwick Beach is on the ocean. The water is salt water. But the analysis of Annie's bone marrow revealed diatoms that are typically associated with fresh water. This was a bombshell. It suggested that Annie had not drowned in the sea at all. It suggested she had drowned in a river, or a lake, or a bathtub somewhere with fresh water. And then, after she was dead, her body had been moved to the beach to make it look like a suicide. The implications of this were terrifying. It meant that Annie had been murdered elsewhere, her body transported and staged. It meant that the police investigation had been fundamentally flawed from the very first moment, and it raised the question, who would go to such lengths to cover up the death of a Swedish tourist? As the family dug deeper, they uncovered strange coincidences that led them into the murky world of international espionage. Annie's full name was Annie Christina Borgesson. At the time of her death, there was a journalist in the United States named Christina Borgesson. This American journalist was investigating a very sensitive topic, rendition flights. Rendition flights were secret flights used by intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, to transport terror suspects to countries where they could be interrogated and often tortured beyond the reach of U.S. law. These flights often used obscure airports for refueling. Prestwick Airport was known to be a hub for U.S. military and government flights. It had been identified as a refueling stop for rendition planes. The family began to wonder, was it possible that this was a case of mistaken identity? Had intelligence agents been monitoring the American journalist, Christina Borgesson? Had they confused her with Annie Christina Borgesson, the linguist living in Edinburgh? It sounded like the plot of a spy thriller, seemingly far-fetched. But in the absence of a credible explanation from the police, the theory took root. There were other oddities. Witnesses reported seeing a person standing at the water's edge at low tide, staring out to sea. But they saw only a back, a silhouette. Friends in Edinburgh recalled that Annie had been acting a little strange in the weeks before her death. She had mentioned feeling watched. She had made vague comments about people listening to her calls. At the time, they dismissed it. Now, it seemed like a premonition. Was Annie suffering from a mental health crisis? Was she paranoid? A sudden psychotic break could explain the flight from the airport. It could explain the wandering, but it could not explain the bruises. Mental illness does not leave finger marks on your throat. It does not hack off your hair. It does not fill your lungs with fresh water when you are found on a saltwater beach. For 18 years, Annie's family has fought for the truth. They have petitioned the Scottish government. They have demanded the release of the crime scene photos and the autopsy photos. They believe these images would prove the existence of the injuries that the undertakers saw, but the authorities have refused. They cite privacy concerns. They say it would be distressing for the family. The Crown Office in Scotland maintains that there is no evidence of criminality. They stick to the suicide theory. They say the case is closed. But for Gudje Borgesson, the case will never be closed until she knows who hurt her daughter. She sits in her home in Sweden, looking at photos of the Viking princess, the girl who loved to dance, the girl who was coming home for Christmas. The mystery of Prestwick Beach remains a gaping wound. It is a story of a life interrupted, a justice system that seemed in a hurry to look away, and a mother's refusal to accept the unacceptable. Annie Borgesson walked into an airport and vanished from the life she knew. She was found on a beach, but the journey she took between those 2 points remains hidden in the shadows. The rain continues to fall, washing the sand of Prestwick Beach, erasing footprints and secrets alike, but it cannot wash away the questions. Why did she turn around? Who made the marks on her neck? And why does the official story refuse to acknowledge what the eyes of the undertakers saw so clearly? As we leave the grey shores of Scotland, the rain turns warmer, but no less heavy. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and red dust. We are heading south, far south, to a land where the earth itself seems to want to swallow you whole. We are going to the Australian outback. The rain that washed over the grey stones of Prestwick now begins to hiss as it hits the scorched earth. The temperature rises rapidly, the air growing heavy and thick, not with the damp chill of the North Atlantic, but with the oppressive humidity of the tropics. The scent of eucalyptus and red dust fills your lungs. We are traveling to a place where the land itself is an adversary, a vast, ancient continent where the horizon stretches forever and civilization is just a thin veneer over the wild. We are in Australia. Specifically, we are moving from the populated coast of New South Wales to the remote, untamed wilderness of far north Queensland. This is the story of a journey into the unknown, a road trip that began in the suburbs and ended in a silence so profound it swallows everything. It is the story of Jamila Humphrey and the white van that became a tomb of mysteries in the scrub. In August 2024, Jamila Humphrey was 52 years old. She lived in a town called Tuckley on the central coast of New South Wales. It is a quiet, pleasant region, a place of lakes and beaches where life moves at a steady, comfortable pace. Jamila was a woman whose life was largely private, known to her immediate circle, but anonymous to the wider world. But in the early hours of Tuesday, August 20th, she made a decision that would thrust her into the headlines. At around 1 o'clock in the morning, Jamila walked out of a residence on Moss Avenue. The streets were quiet, the suburban houses sleeping under the cool winter sky of the southern hemisphere. She climbed into her vehicle, a white Mitsubishi van. It is important to note the nature of this vehicle. It was a standard two-wheel drive van, designed for deliveries or city driving, with small wheels and limited ground clearance. It was the kind of vehicle you take to the shops, or perhaps on a highway trip between cities. It was emphatically not a vehicle designed for what Jamila had in mind. She told family members before she left that she was going to the tip of Cape York. For those unfamiliar with Australian geography, the tip is the northernmost point of the Australian mainland. It is a legendary destination for adventurers. Reaching the tip of Cape York is not a casual Sunday drive. It involves traveling thousands of kilometers, eventually leaving the paved highways behind for red dirt roads that turn into corrugated tracks, river crossings, and treacherous sand. It is a journey that breaks specialized off-road vehicles. To attempt it alone, in a two-wheel drive van, in the middle of the night, suggests a mindset that was either incredibly naive or deeply desperate. Jamila drove out of Tuckley and hit the highway. The distance she intended to cover was approximately 3,300 kilometers. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the distance from London to Moscow or from New York to Salt Lake City. But in Australia, that distance is measured in emptiness. Hour after hour of gum trees, road trains, and the endless ribbon of asphalt. What is most startling about the first leg of this journey is the speed. Jamila covered this massive distance in just 3 days. She must have been driving almost non-stop, fueling up and moving on, eating behind the wheel, sleeping only when exhaustion forced her eyes shut. It was a manic, relentless push north, a race against time, or perhaps a flight from something only she could see. By Friday, August 23rd, she had made it to the far north. The landscape here changes. The temperate forests of the south give way to tropical savanna, termite mounds, and heat. She arrived at the Jardine River ferry, crossing around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The Jardine River is a significant psychological and physical barrier. It separates the main body of Cape York from the northern peninsula area, the final finger of land pointing toward New Guinea. The river is wide, slow-moving, and murky. It is also infested with saltwater crocodiles. These are not the small alligators of Florida. These are massive, prehistoric apex predators that can grow to 20 feet long and view humans simply as biomass. You do not swim in the Jardine. You do not wade in it. You take the ferry. The ferry is a small barge that shuttles vehicles across the water. It is the only safe way across. When Jamila arrived, the security cameras captured her image, and they revealed a disturbing detail. Since leaving New South Wales 3 days earlier, Jamila had altered her appearance. Her hair, which had been a different style and color, was now cut short and dyed brown. Why would a woman racing across the continent stop to dye her hair? It suggests a desire to hide, to change her identity, to become someone else before she reached the end of the road. It adds a layer of calculation to what otherwise looks like a chaotic flight. She paid the ferry fee, $130, and the barge carried her and her white van across the crocodile-infested water to the northern bank. She was close now. The tip of Australia was only about 40 kilometers away. She had driven 3,000 kilometers to get here. She was less than an hour from her destination. She drove off the ferry, onto the northern side, and then she did something that makes no sense. She turned around. Almost immediately after crossing to the north, Jamila drove back onto the ferry and crossed back to the south side. She had come all this way, crossed the final barrier, and then retreated. She didn't just cross back. She approached the ferry staff and asked for a refund of her $130. It was a bizarre, mundane interaction in the middle of nowhere. She was arguing about money at the edge of the world. We don't know if she got the refund, but we know she drove her van off the ferry, back onto the southern bank, heading away from the tip. She drove south. But she didn't stay on the main dirt road, known as the bypass road. Instead, she turned onto the old telegraph track. The old telegraph track is famous in four-wheel drive circles. It was cut through the bush in the 1880s to lay telegraph lines. It is not a road, it is a challenge. It is a series of deep ruts, soft sand, mud pits, and steep creek banks. It is a track that eats modified jeeps and trucks for breakfast. Taking a two-wheel drive Mitsubishi van onto the telegraph track is a physical impossibility. Jamila made it about 3 kilometers south of the Jardine River. The track there is unforgiving. The white van, with its street tires and low clearance, didn't stand a chance. It bogged down. The wheels spun in the soft sand or mud, digging deeper with every revolution until the chassis was resting on the ground. She was stuck. Silence would have descended quickly, the roar of the engine replaced by the buzzing of insects and the heat of the afternoon sun. She was trapped in the bush, surrounded by scrub, miles from the nearest settlement. Most people in this situation would stay with the vehicle. A white van is a large signal. It provides shade. It provides shelter. Inside the van, Jamila had supplies. She had her belongings, but she didn't stay. She opened the door and stepped out into the heat, and she walked away. She left behind her wallet. She left behind her mobile phone. These are the lifelines of modern existence. To leave them behind suggests she had no intention of calling for help, or perhaps no intention of returning. She walked into the wilderness and vanished. The van sat there in the silence, a white anomaly in the green and red landscape. It wasn't discovered until Thursday, August 29th, 5 days after she was believed to have bogged it. A traveler navigating the rough track came across the vehicle, realized it didn't belong there, and alerted the authorities. Police recognized the registration plates immediately. It was the van belonging to the missing woman from New South Wales. Detective Inspector Kevin Gone traveled to the site. He looked at the scene. The van was locked or closed up, the personal effects untouched inside. It looked like she had just stepped out for a moment and never came back. A massive search operation was launched. In this part of the world, a search is a battle against the environment. The heat can kill you in a day. The terrain is dense and confusing. The police called in the state emergency service. They brought in indigenous rangers who knew the land better than anyone. They brought in a legendary Aboriginal tracker, a man trained in the old ways of reading the ground. Aircraft equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew over the canopy, looking for the heat signature of a human body. On the ground, searchers walked line abreast through the scrub, risking snakes and spiders, calling out her name. Jamila! Jamila! The only answer was the call of the birds and the rustle of the wind in the dry leaves. For 2 weeks, they searched. They covered thousands of square kilometers. They checked the water holes, they checked the tracks, but the tracker found no footprints leading away. The thermal cameras found no heat. The bush had swallowed her completely. It was as if she had evaporated the moment she stepped out of the van. Then, on September 6th, 2024, the search was suspended. The police announced they had received additional information. They didn't elaborate on what that information was, but it was significant enough to stop the physical search. They emphasized that the investigation was still active, but the boots on the ground were being pulled back. In the absence of facts, theories rushed in to fill the void. The locals, the people who live on the Cape and know its dangers, had one prevailing thought: the crocodile. The van was only a few kilometers from the Jardine River. If Jamila had walked back toward the river, perhaps to get water, or perhaps to try to cross it again, she would have been entering the danger zone. A crocodile attack is swift and silent. An ambush predator strikes from the water, grabs its prey, and drags it under. There is no struggle, no scream, often no trace left behind. Bodies taken by crocodiles are rarely recovered intact. It is a terrifying possibility. the idea that she was consumed by the ancient reptile that guards the river crossing. Others looked at her behavior, the hair dye, the speed of the trip, the refund request, and saw something else. They saw a woman who was running. Rumors circulated that Jamila had gone missing before. Police records confirmed that in November 2022, she had been reported missing from the same address in Tuckley, only to be found later. Was this another attempt to disappear? A voluntary missing person who wanted to be lost? But if she wanted to disappear and start a new life, why leave the wallet? Why leave the phone? Why drive down a dead-end track and abandon the vehicle? Disappearing requires resources. Walking into the bush with nothing is not a way to start a new life. It is a way to end one. There was also speculation about criminal involvement. Earlier that year, a massive drug bust had occurred in the region, with millions of dollars of cocaine seized. Could she have seen something she wasn't supposed to see? Could she have been intercepted? The police dismissed any link to the drug trade, calling it unfounded speculation. The white van was eventually recovered, winched out of the sand and towed away, but the mystery remains. Jamila Humphrey drove to the edge of the continent, changed her appearance, crossed a river, crossed back, and then walked into oblivion. Did she succumb to the heat? Was she taken by a predator? Or is she still out there, hiding in the vastness of a country that is big enough to hide anyone who doesn't want to be found? The search expert, Steve Darcy, criticized the scaling back of the search. He argued that more resources, more dogs, more time should have been spent. He believed that if she was out there, she could be found. But the police made their call based on the intelligence they had. And so, the scrub of Cape York keeps its secret. As the rain falls against your window, imagine the silence of the Australian bush. It is a heavy silence, a silence that watches you. Jamila Humphrey stepped into that silence, and it closed behind her like a heavy door. She is a ghost in the landscape, a question mark at the end of a long, dusty road. But we cannot stay in the heat. The darkness is pulling us back to the city, to the concrete and the streetlights, where the monsters look just like everyone else. We are going to Philadelphia. The rain continues to fall, tapping a steady, rhythmic warning against the glass. It is the sound of a city sleeping, oblivious to the monsters that walk its streets. We leave the red dust of the Australian outback and travel to the cobblestones and brownstones of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The year is 1998. It is a time of promise, of spring flowers blooming in Rittenhouse Square, and of a young woman with the world at her feet. Shannon Schieber was 23 years old, a woman of extraordinary intellect and boundless potential. She was the kind of person who didn't just participate in life, she devoured it. She had graduated from Duke University in just 3 years, a feat that speaks to her ferocious work ethic and sharp mind. She held a triple major in mathematics, economics, and philosophy. She wasn't just smart, she was brilliant. In the spring of '98, Shannon was finishing her first year as a doctoral student in finance at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For those who don't know, Wharton is not just a school, it is an institution, a training ground for the masters of the universe. To be there is to be among the elite. Shannon had moved from her family home in Chevy Chase, Maryland, to pursue this dream, settling into a life of rigorous study and city living. She lived in an apartment in the Fittler Square neighborhood of Center City, near 23rd and Manning Streets. It was a lovely area, known for its tree-lined streets, elegant brick row houses, and a sense of safety that comes with affluence. It was the kind of place where young professionals and students lived, where you could walk home from the library at night and feel the comforting hum of the city around you. Shannon's apartment was her sanctuary. It was a modest but comfortable space where she could spread out her books, work on her research, and build the independent life she had always wanted. She was a strong personality, a woman who filled a room with her presence. Her mother, Vicky, remembered her as someone who made people take notice. She was compassionate, curious, and deeply loved by her family and her brother, Sean. But there was a rot beneath the surface of this idyllic neighborhood. Unknown to Shannon, and unknown to the thousands of women who lived in Center City, a predator was hunting in their midst. Throughout 1997 and into 1998, a series of terrifying attacks had occurred along the Pine Street corridor, just blocks from where Shannon slept. The pattern was chillingly consistent. An intruder would enter homes in the early morning hours, slipping through unlocked windows or prying open side doors. He was a shadow that moved through the dark. He would wake his victims, strangle them into submission, and assault them in their own beds. He was soft-spoken, sometimes whispering to the terrified women. In one case, he told a victim, "I wish we'd met under different circumstances." It was a twisted, delusional attempt at intimacy from a man who thrived on power and control. 4 women had been attacked before Shannon ever moved to the neighborhood. But here is the tragedy. The community didn't know. There were no flyers on telephone poles. There were no warnings on the news. The police had failed to connect the dots, or worse, they had refused to see them. The Philadelphia Police Department's Sex Crimes Unit was, at the time, a broken institution. A culture of skepticism and laziness had taken root. Detectives who tried to investigate were stonewalled. Crimes were systematically downgraded. Rapes were classified as simple assaults or burglaries to make the city's crime statistics look better. The predator was being protected by the very bureaucracy that was supposed to hunt him. On the evening of May 6, 1998, Shannon was home. She was preparing for another day of classes, perhaps reading a textbook or organizing her notes. She had plans to meet her brother, Sean, for lunch the next day. It was a mundane, quiet Wednesday night. She checked her locks, turned off the lights, and went to bed, unaware that she was being watched. The intruder came in the early morning hours of May 7th. He had selected her. He had watched her. He found a way in, likely through a balcony door or a window that had been left unlatched in the spring air. He crept into her bedroom, a silhouette against the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Shannon woke to a nightmare. Around midnight, a neighbor in Shannon's building was jolted awake by a sound that freezes the blood. He heard a woman's voice scream out, "Help!" It was a desperate, terrified cry. It was followed by sounds of a struggle, and then a chilling, choking noise. The neighbor didn't hesitate. He did exactly what a good citizen should do. He picked up the phone and dialed 911. This is the moment where Shannon Schieber should have been saved. 2 patrol officers were dispatched to the scene. They arrived within 6 minutes. 6 minutes. That is a rapid response. They stood outside Shannon's door. They knocked. Silence. They knocked again. No answer. They looked for signs of forced entry on the door, but the lock was engaged from the inside. They stood there for about 5 minutes. 5 agonizing minutes. Inside that apartment, on the other side of that thin wooden door, Shannon was fighting for her life. She was being strangled. She was dying. And the officers, hearing nothing, made a decision that would haunt the city for decades. They assumed it was a false alarm. They assumed it was a domestic dispute that had quieted down. They left. They didn't break down the door. They didn't find the neighbor who called to ask what he heard. They simply walked away. They got back in their patrol car and drove off, leaving Shannon alone with her killer. It is a failure of duty so profound it is hard to comprehend. The silence they heard wasn't peace, it was death. The next afternoon, May 8th, Sean Schieber waited for his sister at the restaurant where they were supposed to have lunch. Shannon didn't show up. Shannon was never late. She never missed an appointment without calling. A cold knot of dread formed in Sean's stomach. He called her phone. No answer. He knew. In the way that family members often know, he knew something was wrong. He drove to her apartment building. He rang the buzzer. No answer. He started ringing other buzzers until someone let him in. By a twist of fate, the person who let him in was the same neighbor who had called the police the night before. Together, they went to Shannon's door. They knocked. They shouted her name. Nothing. Driven by panic, they forced the door open. The sight that greeted them shattered their world. Shannon's apartment was silent. Sean moved toward the bedroom. There, he found his sister. She was lying on her bed, naked, face down. She had been strangled. The life had been choked out of her hours before, while the police stood in the hallway. The grief that followed was overwhelming, but it was quickly joined by a burning rage. The Philadelphia police launched a homicide investigation, but they were starting from a deficit of trust. Detectives Chuck Boyle and Jeffrey Parr took the lead. They did the standard work first. They looked at a fellow student Shannon had filed a stalking complaint against. They interrogated him. They took his DNA. But weeks later, the results came back negative. It wasn't him. They ran the DNA found at the scene. Semen recovered from Shannon's body through the databases. No hits. They were chasing a ghost. The killer had vanished into the city he had terrorized. But Boyle and Parr were dogged. They began to look beyond the immediate circle. They asked to see the files on other assaults in the area. They wanted to compare the DNA from Shannon's murder to the evidence from the downgraded crimes, the ones the department had tried to ignore. This was the turning point. In January 1999, 8 months after the murder, the lab results came back. The DNA from Shannon's killer matched 4 other assault cases in Center City. The realization hit the detectives like a physical blow. Shannon wasn't a random victim. She was the latest victim of a serial rapist who had been operating with impunity for 2 years. The Center City rapist was real. And because the police had downgraded the earlier crimes, refusing to acknowledge the pattern, the public had never been warned. Shannon had gone to bed that night thinking she was safe, unaware that a monster was hunting in her zip code. The scandal exploded. The Philadelphia Inquirer published an expose detailing how thousands of rape cases had been buried to manipulate statistics. Shannon's parents, Sylvester and Vicky, were devastated, but they channeled their grief into action. They sued the city. They didn't do it for money. They did it for accountability. A jury found that while the police had manipulated the data, the city wasn't legally liable for Shannon's death. But the moral verdict was clear. The system had to change. And it did. The Sex Crimes Unit was dismantled and rebuilt. A new Special Victims Unit was created, with new protocols and better training. Philadelphia became a model for how to handle sexual assault cases. But reforms, no matter how necessary, could not bring Shannon back. And they didn't catch the killer. The years dragged on. The composite sketch of the suspect hung in precinct houses, staring out with blank eyes. There was another attack in August 1999. A student at the University of the Arts was raped and strangled. The DNA matched. The killer was still out there. And then he stopped. The attack ceased. The trail went cold. It wasn't until 2001 that the phone rang in Philadelphia. It was the police from Fort Collins, Colorado. They had a problem. A serial rapist was attacking women in their college town. The MO was identical. He broke in through windows. He strangled his victims. He was soft-spoken. He was polite. The detectives compared notes. In Fort Collins, the rapist had made a mistake. He had left behind a sweaty baseball cap at a crime scene. The lab extracted DNA from the sweatband. They sent the profile to Philadelphia. It was a match. The Center City rapist and the Fort Collins rapist were the same man. Now the net could tighten. Investigators began to look for men who had lived in Philadelphia in the late 90s and then moved to Fort Collins in 2000 or 2001. They cross-referenced driver's licenses, credit card records, and rental agreements. From millions of people, they narrowed it down to a list of 44 names. One name stood out: Troy Graves. He was 29 years old. He had lived in Philadelphia during the Center City attacks. In 1999, just after the last attack in Philly, he had joined the Air Force. He was stationed at Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming, just a short drive from Fort Collins. He fit the timeline perfectly. On April 23, 2002, police in Fort Collins brought Troy Graves in for questioning. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a clean-cut Air Force guy. He was polite. He was calm. But his wife, who was being interviewed in another room, dropped a bombshell. She mentioned a baseball cap he used to have, one that had gone missing. She mentioned that she thought he looked like the sketch on the police flyers. The police took his DNA. They took his fingerprints. It was over. The fingerprints matched the Colorado scenes. The DNA matched the semen found on Shannon Schieber's body. Troy Graves was the man. He was the Center City rapist. He was the murderer. Graves realized there was no escape. To avoid the death penalty, he confessed. He sat in an interrogation room and detailed his crimes with a chilling, detached precision. He remembered the apartments. He remembered the women. He admitted to murdering Shannon. He said he had watched her, chosen her, and killed her when she screamed. On May 30th, 2002, Troy Graves stood in a Philadelphia courtroom. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Shannon Schieber and the assaults on the other women. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will die in a concrete box, a fitting end for a man who stole so much life from others. Shannon Schieber's legacy is not just her tragic death, it is the safety of the women who came after her. Because of her family's fight, the Philadelphia Police Department was forced to change. The way sexual assaults are investigated in America was overhauled. The Shannon Schieber effect saved lives. But tonight, as the rain falls on the city, we remember the woman, not the symbol. We remember the triple major from Duke, the doctoral student, the sister, the daughter. We remember the future that was stolen in 6 minutes of silence, while the police stood outside a door and did nothing. The sound of the rain is heavy now, drowning out the noise of the city. It washes over the brownstones of Philadelphia and carries us east, across the Atlantic Ocean, to the towering peaks of the French Alps. We are going to a place of breathtaking beauty, where a family holiday turned into an international mystery that remains unsolved to this day. The heavy rain in Philadelphia fades into a cold, persistent drizzle that mists the windshields of cars winding through mountain passes. The air grows thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. We are leaving the gritty streets of the American city and ascending into the breathtaking heights of the French Alps. This is a place of postcard beauty, where snow-capped peaks reflect in crystal-clear lakes, and silence is usually a sign of peace. But in September 2012, that silence was shattered by the echo of 21 gunshots. We are heading to a remote forest road near the village of Cheveline, overlooking Lake Annecy. It is a location that should be associated with hikers, cyclists, and families enjoying a summer holiday. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most baffling and brutal massacres in modern European history. Saad al-Hili was a 50-year-old engineer who had built a successful, quiet life in the United Kingdom. Born in Baghdad, Iraq, he had moved to Britain decades earlier, fleeing the instability of his homeland to find safety in the leafy suburbs of Claygate, Surrey. He was a man of intellect and precision, working as a satellite engineer on complex technical projects. He was known to be methodical, a trait that served him well in his profession. He lived in a comfortable mock Tudor home with his wife, Iqbal, who was 47. Iqbal was a dentist, a woman described by friends as kind and devoted to her family. Together, they were raising two daughters, Zainab, who was 7 years old, and little Zina, who was just 4. They were the picture of a successful immigrant family, living the dream of stability and education for their children. In late August 2012, the Al-Hili family hitched their white caravan to the back of their maroon BMW station wagon and headed for France. They were going on a camping trip, a classic family holiday. Joining them was Iqbal's mother, Suhaila Al-Alaf, a 74-year-old woman who lived in Sweden but had come along to spend precious time with her grandchildren. They settled into a campsite near Lake Annecy, a region known as the Pearl of the French Alps. The days were filled with the simple pleasures of camping, sleeping in the caravan, exploring the local villages, and taking in the stunning alpine scenery. It was supposed to be a time of relaxation, a break from the pressures of work and school. There was no indication that they were being watched or followed. On the afternoon of Wednesday, September 5th, the family decided to go for a drive. It was a beautiful, mild day. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they left the campsite. Zainab, the 7-year-old, had apparently asked to go for a walk in the woods, away from the bustle of the tourist spots. Saad, ever the doting father, drove the BMW toward the mountains to find a suitable trail. They stopped in the village of Dussard around 3:15. A tourist camera captured them there, a happy family posing for a photograph. Saad, Iqbal, the grandmother, and the two girls. They were smiling, relaxed, framed by the majestic mountains. It is a haunting image, the final record of a family that was minutes away from annihilation. They got back in the car and continued up a narrow, winding road. The road they chose was the Route Forestière Domaniale de la Comdière. It is a steep, single-track road that winds up the side of the mountain, flanked by dense forest on both sides. It is not a main thoroughfare, it is a dead end. It leads only to a small gravel parking area used by hikers and foresters. It is a place of profound isolation, where the only sounds are the wind in the trees and the call of birds. At the same time the Al-Hilis were driving up the mountain, two cyclists were also navigating the steep ascent. Brett Martin was a British tourist, a former Royal Air Force pilot who had a holiday home in the area. He was a fit, experienced cyclist, pushing himself on the challenging climb. Further ahead of him was a French cyclist named Sylvain Mollier. Mollier was a local man, a 45-year-old father of 3 who worked at a specialized metals factory that supplied the nuclear industry. He was riding a high-end road bike, and as he pedaled up the incline, he overtook Brett Martin. The two men exchanged no words, just the silent acknowledgement of two athletes tackling the same hill. Mollier pulled ahead, disappearing around the bends of the forest road. Brett Martin continued his climb, his breath coming in steady rhythms. As he approached the small parking area at the top of the road, known as La Martinée, he expected to find emptiness. Instead, he found a scene that his brain initially refused to process. It was around 3:45 in the afternoon. The first thing he noticed was a bicycle lying in the middle of the road. The wheels of the bike were still spinning. This is a detail that Martin would later recount with chilling clarity. The kinetic energy of the crash had not yet dissipated. The bike lay on its side, its rider sprawled on the ground nearby. Martin's first thought was that there had been a terrible accident. Perhaps the car he saw ahead had hit the cyclist. The car was the maroon BMW estate belonging to the Al-Hili family. It was stationary, but its engine was revving furiously. The rear wheels were spinning in the gravel, kicking up dust and smoke. The car was stuck, its rear end embedded in the soft earth of the embankment. It looked as though the driver had tried to reverse at high speed, panicked, and lost control, beaching the vehicle on the slope. Martin approached cautiously. The smell of burning rubber and hot metal hung in the air, mixing with the scent of the pine forest. He moved toward the cyclist, intending to offer first aid, but as he got closer, the reality of the scene shifted from accident to atrocity. The cyclist, Sylvain Mollier, was dead. He lay on his back, his eyes open, staring at the sky. Mollier had been shot. The wounds were visible, brutal, and undeniable. Martin, with his military background, recognized the signs of gunfire immediately. He realized then that he had not stumbled upon a traffic collision. He had walked into a kill zone. He looked toward the revving BMW. The windows were shattered. The glass lay in diamonds on the gravel. As he stood there, frozen by the horror of the realization, a figure stumbled out from the front of the car. It was a child. It was Zainab al-Hili. She was covered in blood, her movements erratic and weak. She took a few steps toward Martin and then collapsed onto the road. She had been shot in the shoulder and beaten so savagely around the head that her skull was fractured. Martin rushed to her. He placed her in the recovery position, checking her airway. She was alive, but barely. He looked into the car, and what he saw would haunt him forever. Inside the vehicle were 3 adults. Saad was in the driver's seat. Iqbal and her mother, Suhaila, were in the back. They were all dead. The violence inside that car was absolute. Saad had been shot multiple times. Iqbal and Suhaila had also been riddled with bullets. It was a slaughter. The interior of the car was a landscape of blood and broken glass. The engine continued to scream, the wheels spinning in the dirt, a mechanical howl of distress that underscored the silence of the dead. Martin knew he had to get help, but there was no cell phone signal in this remote hollow of the mountains. He was trapped with the dead and the dying, miles from civilization. He heard the sound of an engine approaching, a car coming up the road, the killer returning. Martin prepared himself for a confrontation. But it was not a car. It was another vehicle, a 4x4 driven by a local man. Martin flagged him down, shouting that there had been a shooting. The man, panicked by the sight of the bodies, agreed to drive back down the mountain to find a signal and call the police. Martin stayed. He stayed with Zainab, comforting the unconscious child, keeping watch over the massacre. When the police finally arrived, they sealed off the mountain. The road was closed. Helicopters circled overhead. The media began to gather at the cordon, sensing a story of international magnitude. But amidst the chaos and the forensic examination, a terrible oversight was occurring. A second miracle was hiding in the dark. The police, following strict protocols, did not open the doors of the BMW immediately. They were waiting for specialized forensic teams from Paris to arrive. They feared booby traps. They feared contaminating the scene. They looked through the shattered windows and saw the bodies. They assumed everyone inside was dead. For 8 long hours, the car sat there. The sun went down, the temperature dropped, the forest grew dark. And inside the car, huddled under the skirt of her dead mother's legs, was 4-year-old Zina. She was alive. She was unhurt physically, but she was terrified into a catatonic silence. Imagine the experience of that child, the noise of the gunshots, the screaming, the glass breaking, and then the silence. She curled up in the footwell of the back seat, hiding beneath the fabric of her mother's clothes, surrounded by the smell of blood and death. She lay there while the police walked around the car. She lay there while the helicopter rotors beat the air. She lay there for 8 hours, too afraid to make a sound. It wasn't until the forensic team from Paris arrived and opened the doors around midnight that they found her. A gendarme reached into the car, and the little girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with trauma. Her first words were reportedly, "Where is Mummy?" It was a moment of heartbreaking relief, mixed with horror at what she had endured. The investigation that followed was one of the most complex in French history. The ballistic analysis revealed that 21 shots had been fired. 17 of them hit the victims. The shooting was not a spray of automatic fire. It was methodical. Each victim had been shot twice in the head. It looked like a professional hit. But the weapon used told a confusing story. It was a Luger P6, a 7.65 millimeter semi-automatic pistol. This was an antique weapon, a gun that had been used by the Swiss Army in the 1920s. It was a collector's item, not the tool of a modern contract killer. Why would a professional assassin use a museum piece that holds only 8 rounds and requires reloading multiple times? The killer would have had to stop, eject the magazine, load a new one, and rack the slide, all while maintaining control of the scene. It suggested a shooter who was calm, practiced, and comfortable with this specific, unusual firearm. But it didn't fit the profile of a hitman hired by a state or a criminal organization. Theories proliferated. Was Saad the target? Investigators looked deep into his life. They found a bitter feud with his brother, Zaid al-Hili. The two men had been fighting over their father's inheritance, an estate that included properties and a Swiss bank account containing £800,000. Saad and Zaid had not spoken in months. Zaid was arrested in England, questioned, but ultimately released. There was no evidence linking him to the hiring of a hitman. Was Sylvain Molière, the cyclist, the target? He worked in the nuclear industry. Was he selling secrets? Was he involved in an affair? Investigators probed every aspect of his life, but they found nothing. He was a family man, a dedicated worker. The theory emerged that he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, the first victim shot to eliminate a witness. Or was it the work of a local madman, a serial killer operating in the Alps? Police looked at Nordal Lelandais, a former soldier who was later convicted of killing a little girl and a young soldier in the region. He had a history of violence and instability. But despite intense scrutiny, no forensic link could be found between him and the Chevaline murders. The case remains a puzzle of contradictions. The professional execution style of the killings clashes with the antique weapon. The clear targeting of the family clashes with the lack of a concrete motive. The presence of the cyclist complicates every timeline. Was he shot first? Was he shot last? The tracks of the BMW showed Saad had tried to flee, reversing frantically before getting stuck. 13 years have passed. The forest has reclaimed the silence of the route forestière. The gravel has been washed clean by the rain and snow. But the mystery endures. Who was the man who stood on that road and calmly reloaded his antique pistol while a family screamed? Zainab and Zina, the two survivors, were given new identities. They were taken into care, raised away from the spotlight. They are young women now, carrying the burden of a memory they can never share and likely can barely understand. They are the only witnesses, but their memories are fragmented by trauma and youth. The Alps massacre stands as a chilling reminder that there is no such thing as a perfect sanctuary. You can drive to the top of a mountain, miles from the nearest city, surrounded by the majesty of nature, and still find yourself in the crosshairs of evil. The beauty of Lake Annecy is now forever stained by the memory of the maroon BMW and the spinning wheels of a bicycle on a lonely forest road. As the cold wind of the Alps fades, we descend from the mountains. The air grows warmer, thicker. We are moving from the silence of the forest to the bustling, humid nights of Kuala Lumpur. We are going to a place where safety is supposed to be guaranteed by lights and cameras, but where a single moment of distraction can lead to a lifetime of pain. The mountain air of the Alps is thin and sharp, but where we are going next, the air is heavy. It sits on your skin like a wet blanket, thick with humidity and the smell of damp vegetation. We are leaving the cold, crisp mystery of Europe and traveling back in time deep into the sweltering darkness of eastern India. The rain outside your window transforms now. It is no longer the sleet of the mountains, it is the monsoon rain, warm and relentless, drumming against the metal roofs of rusted hangars. The year is 1958. The location is an abandoned airfield, a relic of a world war that had ended more than a decade earlier, now left to rot in the jungle. This story explores the terrifying power of the human mind. We often fear what is out there in the dark, the ghosts, the demons, the monsters under the bed. But as this case demonstrates, the most dangerous thing in the darkness is often our own imagination. When belief overrides reality, ordinary shadows can become nightmares, and innocent people can pay the price for our hallucinations. Ram Thapa was a young man living a life defined by simple, rigid structures. He was a loyal employee, a man who followed orders, and someone who held a deep, unshakable belief in the supernatural. In the culture and time he lived in, the line between the physical world and the spiritual world was thin. Ghosts were not metaphors, they were neighbors. Demons were not symbols of evil, they were physical entities that could hurt you. On the night of May 20th, 1958, Ram found himself standing at the perimeter of a place that terrified him. It was an abandoned airport, a sprawling complex of crumbling concrete and rusting metal that had been reclaimed by the wilderness. The jungle had moved in, vines choking the control towers, tall grass swallowing the runways. To the locals, this was not just a ruin, it was a cursed place. Rumors swirled around the airfield like the evening mist. People whispered that the old hangars were infested with spirits. They said that the restless souls of soldiers and pilots still wandered the tarmac, unable to move on. They said that if you went there at night, you would see things that would turn your hair white. Ram believed every word of it. But Ram was not there by choice. He was there because of his boss. His employer was a man of business, a pragmatist who saw opportunity where others saw only ghosts. The boss was considering buying the land, perhaps to redevelop it, perhaps to salvage the scrap metal. But before he made an investment, he wanted to inspect the property, and because he was a man who scoffed at superstition, he decided to do it at night. He recruited 3 men to accompany him, another employee, a friend, and Ram Thapa. For the boss and his friends, this was a lark. It was an adventure, a ghost hunt undertaken with a sense of irony and amusement. They brought flashlights to cut through the gloom, joking about what they might find. They were armed with skepticism. Ram, however, was armed with something else. He had brought a large knife. This was not a tool for clearing brush. In Ram's mind, this was a weapon of defense against the supernatural. He was terrified. His stomach churned with nausea. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't want to be there, but his loyalty to his boss, and perhaps the fear of losing his job, forced his feet forward. The group approached the main gate. It was a massive structure of iron and wire, rusted shut by years of neglect. The boss stepped forward and unlocked it. He pushed. The metal groaned, a high-pitched shriek of friction that echoed through the silent night. To Ram, that sound was like a warning scream. It was the sound of a seal being broken, releasing whatever evil had been trapped inside. The gate swung open, revealing the black maw of the airfield. The beams of their flashlights sliced into the darkness, catching motes of dust and the eyes of insects. Beyond the cones of light, the world was absolute pitch black. The sheer size of the place made the darkness feel heavier. Hangars loomed like sleeping giants. The skeletons of broken-down planes sat on the tarmac, their wings bent and broken. They began to walk. The boss led the way, confident and brisk. Ram trailed at the back, his hand gripping the handle of his knife so tightly his knuckles were white. He was in a state of hyper-vigilance. Every rustle of the wind in the grass sounded like a footstep. Every shadow that stretched and warped as the flashlights moved looked like a grasping hand. He felt sick. The atmosphere was oppressive. The silence of the airfield was not empty, it was heavy, waiting. Ram scanned the perimeter constantly, his eyes darting from the dilapidated buildings to the encroaching tree line. He expected to see a ghost staring back at him from every broken window. He was priming himself, his brain looking for patterns in the noise, desperate to identify the threat he knew was there. They reached the runway. It was a long, flat expanse of concrete, cracked and weedy, stretching away into the gloom. There was nothing ahead of them but the empty strip where planes used to roar into the sky. The boss and the other two men turned their attention to the side, shining their lights toward a massive hangar. They were looking for squatters, or perhaps just exploring the ruins, flashing their beams into the dark, gaping windows. Ram, however, did not look at the hangar. He looked straight ahead, down the length of the runway. And there, in the distance, he saw it. About 200 meters away, hovering in the darkness just off to the side of the tarmac, was a light. It was a floating orb, glowing with a pale, sickly luminescence. It bobbed in the air, untethered to anything visible. To a modern eye, or a skeptical eye, it might have looked like a lantern. But Ram was not looking with a skeptical eye. He was looking through the lens of terror. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. He gestured frantically to the others. "Look," he whispered, or perhaps he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The boss and the other men turned. They followed Ram's gaze. They swung their flashlights around, the beams cutting through the humid air until they illuminated the source of the anomaly. They saw the light, too. They saw the floating orb. But as their powerful flashlights washed over the area, they saw something else beneath it. There were figures. Dark, shapeless forms moving on the ground right below the floating light. They were gray, indistinct, shifting in the shadows. To the boss and his friends, this was strange. It was a curiosity. They might have squinted, trying to resolve the shapes into something recognizable. But Ram's mind had already made the leap. He didn't see people. He didn't see animals. He saw demons. The figures seemed to be dancing or writhing. And then, in a moment that would seal the tragedy, the figures reacted to the light. They turned. As the beams of the flashlights hit them, their eyes caught the reflection. They glinted in the darkness. To Ram, this was the confirmation of his worst nightmare. He saw glowing eyes staring back at him from the abyss. He saw a horde of evil spirits, led by a floating will-o'-the-wisp, preparing to consume them. The fear that had been building in him since he walked through the gate crested like a tidal wave. It overwhelmed his reason. It overwhelmed his senses. Something inside him snapped. It was a primitive, survivalist click. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he and his companions were about to be killed by supernatural forces. He believed he was the only thing standing between his boss and eternal damnation. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He didn't check with the others. He reacted. With a scream of terror and rage, Ram Thapa tightened his grip on the knife and bolted forward. He ran into the darkness, charging toward the floating orb and the glowing eyes. He was a warrior going into battle against the forces of hell. He closed the distance in seconds, his adrenaline fueling a speed and strength he didn't know he possessed. He reached the figures. He didn't pause to identify them. He swung the knife. He attacked with the ferocity of a man fighting for his soul. He slashed and stabbed, striking out at the ghosts that had dared to manifest in his world. The darkness erupted in screams, but they were not the wails of the damned. They were the terrified human screams of women. The reality of what happened that night is a tragedy of perception. The ghosts were not spirits. They were 3 local women. They had come onto the abandoned airfield under the cover of darkness for a very mundane reason. They were picking flowers. Specifically, they were likely gathering hog plums or other wild vegetation that grew near the runway. The floating orb that had terrified Ram was nothing more than a simple lantern they had brought with them to see what they were doing. They had hung it on a branch or held it aloft, creating the illusion of a disembodied light. The gray figures writhing on the ground were simply the women bending over, picking plants from the earth. And the glowing eyes, just the reflection of the men's flashlights in the women's eyes as they looked up, startled by the intruders. Ram Thapa had not attacked demons. He had attacked 3 defenseless women gathering flowers in the night. The aftermath was horrific. By the time the red mist of Ram's panic cleared, the damage was done. One of the women was dead. The other 2 were severely wounded, bleeding on the cracked concrete of the runway. The lantern lay smashed, its light extinguished. The silence of the airfield returned, now broken by the groans of the injured and the realization of the horror that had just occurred. A few hours later, the scene shifted from the humid jungle to the harsh fluorescent lights of a police station. Ram Thapa was in handcuffs. He sat there, likely in a state of shock, trying to reconcile the reality of his actions with the reality he had perceived. He had gone in to save his boss from ghosts. He had come out a murderer. Ram was charged with murder and assault. The case seemed open and shut. He had attacked unarmed women with a knife. There were witnesses. There was a body. But the legal system is designed to judge not just the act, but the intent. And Ram's intent became the central question of the trial. When the case went to court, Ram's defense did not deny that he had killed the woman. They didn't deny the attack. Instead, they argued a point of law that is rarely seen: mistake of fact. They argued that Ram Thapa genuinely, wholly, and without a shadow of a doubt, believed he was attacking ghosts. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He wasn't a man driven by malice toward these women. He didn't even know them. He was a man driven by a specific, culturally reinforced phobia. He believed he was acting in self-defense against a supernatural threat. The jury listened to the testimony. They heard about the rumors surrounding the airport. They heard about the atmospheric conditions, the darkness, the distance, the floating light. They heard about Ram's state of mind, his palpable terror before he even entered the gate. And they looked at the man in the dock, a loyal employee who thought he was being a hero. In a verdict that remains a fascinating case study in legal history, the jury believed him. They accepted that Ram Thapa lacked the mens rea, the guilty mind, required for a murder conviction. They accepted that in his reality, at that moment, he was fighting demons. Ram Thapa was acquitted of all charges. He walked free. But one has to wonder if he was ever truly free. He lived the rest of his life knowing that his mind had tricked him into taking an innocent life. He learned the hardest lesson of all, that the monsters we create in our heads are far more lethal than anything that actually lives in the dark. The abandoned airport remained, slowly consumed by the jungle. The rust continued to spread. But now, there was a real ghost story attached to it. Not of soldiers or pilots, but of a woman picking flowers, and a man who brought a knife to a gunfight with his own imagination. As the rain continues to fall outside, drowning out the sounds of the night, remember Ram Thapa. Remember that fear is a powerful lens. It can distort a lantern into a demon. It can turn a neighbor into a monster. And it can turn a regular Tuesday night into a tragedy that lasts forever. We leave the ghosts of India behind us now. The air cools slightly, losing the heavy humidity of the jungle, but retaining the stickiness of a tropical city. We are moving to the concrete canyons of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. We are going to a place that should be safe, a brightly lit shopping mall, surrounded by people, laughter, and family. But as we are about to see, Safety is often just an illusion, and danger can arrive with a smile and a slammed car door. The rain that fell on the abandoned airfield in India now shifts its rhythm. It becomes heavier, warmer, drumming relentlessly against the concrete skyline of a modern metropolis. We are leaving the silence of the jungle and entering the chaotic, vibrant heart of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The year is 2003. It is a time of humidity, bright city lights, and the comforting noise of a bustling capital. But beneath the neon glow, predators are watching, waiting for the single moment when a life of promise steps into the shadows. Kaniong Le Kian was the embodiment of success and filial piety. At 28 years old, she had built a life that many would envy. She was a woman of intelligence and drive, having left her home in Malaysia to pursue an education in the United States. She studied economics at the University of Hawaii, before moving to the mainland to carve out a career in the competitive world of information technology. She worked as an IT analyst in San Diego, California, a role that demanded precision and foresight. She had found love in America as well. She was married to a man named Brandon, and together they had created a life filled with future plans and shared dreams. To her friends and colleagues in the U.S., Kani was a rising star, a woman who had conquered a new world. But to her family in Kuala Lumpur, she was simply a beloved daughter and sister. And in June 2003, she had returned home for a reason that was both heartbreaking and noble. Her father was battling cancer. Kani had flown thousands of miles, leaving her husband and her job behind temporarily, to be by his side. She wanted to spend time with him, to care for him, to cherish the moments that illness was threatening to steal. This visit was an act of deep love, a testament to the bond she shared with her family. It was supposed to be a time of healing and togetherness, not the prelude to a national tragedy. On the evening of June 13, 2003, Kani joined her family and close friends for a dinner at the Bangsar shopping complex. This was an upscale venue, a popular gathering spot for locals and expatriates alike. It was a place of safety, filled with laughter, the clinking of cutlery, and the hum of conversation. The group shared a meal, enjoying the company, savoring the precious time they had together before Kani would have to return to the States. As the dinner wound down and the group prepared to leave, a small, mundane problem arose. It was the kind of trivial annoyance that happens to everyone. Kani's mother and sister realized they had left the parking ticket inside the car. The vehicle was parked in the basement level of the shopping complex. Without the ticket, they couldn't pay, and they couldn't leave. Kani, ever the helpful daughter, volunteered to retrieve it. It was a simple gesture. "I'll be right back," she might have said. She stood up, perhaps adjusting her dress or grabbing her keys, and walked away from the table. She stepped onto the escalator and descended toward the basement parking garage. Her mother and sister watched her go, expecting her to return in 5 or 10 minutes. They had no way of knowing that they would never see her alive again. The basement of a shopping mall is a liminal space. It is a world of concrete, fluorescent lights, and echoes. The air is often stale, smelling of exhaust fumes and rubber. Shadows stretch long between the rows of parked cars. Kani walked through this concrete maze, heading toward her car, a Proton Tierra. She was likely thinking about the dinner, or her flight back to the U.S., or her father's health. She was not thinking about survival. But someone else was in that parking garage. Ahmad Najib bin Aris was a 27-year-old aircraft cabin cleaning supervisor. He was not there to shop, he was there to hunt. He had been lurking in the shadows, watching the flow of people, looking for an opportunity. When he saw Kani, a petite, attractive woman walking alone toward her vehicle, he saw his chance. Kani reached her car. She leaned in, perhaps reaching across the seat to find the ticket on the dashboard or in the console. Her guard was down. She was in a public place, surrounded by other cars, just floors below a busy restaurant. In that moment of distraction, Ahmad Najib struck. He rushed her. The attack was sudden, brutal, and overwhelming. He shoved her inside the car. Imagine the sheer shock of that moment. The world turning upside down in a split second. One moment you are looking for a piece of paper. The next, a stranger is forcing you into your own vehicle. Canny likely tried to scream, tried to fight, but the confined space of the car worked against her. Ahmad Najib climbed into the driver's seat, seizing control of the vehicle and the situation. He started the engine and slammed the car into reverse. He didn't bother with the ticket, he didn't bother with the exit queue. He smashed through the parking garage barriers, the wooden boom gate splintering under the force of the impact. The noise would have been deafening, a violent crash that echoed through the garage. Debris scattered across the concrete. And then, the Proton Tiara sped out into the night, carrying Canny away from her family and into the darkness. Upstairs, the minutes ticked by. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. Canny's mother and sister began to worry. Why was it taking so long? Had she gotten lost? They tried to call her phone. No answer. The worry turned to dread. They alerted the security guards. They alerted the friends who had been at dinner. A search began. They rushed to the security control room to review the CCTV footage. The grainy images on the monitors confirmed their worst fears. They saw the recording of Canny reaching into her car. They saw the shadow of the man lunging at her. They saw the car speeding away. It was a kidnapping caught on tape, a silent horror film playing out in real time. But by then, Canny was already gone. Ahmad Najib drove the car out of the affluent neighborhood of Bangsar and into the sprawling network of roads that surrounds Kuala Lumpur. Canny was trapped in the passenger seat, terrified, her mind racing. She was a smart woman, an analyst. She would have been looking for a way out, calculating her odds. And incredibly, 2 opportunities for rescue presented themselves that night. 2 moments where fate almost intervened. The first occurred just after midnight, near a place called Kelana Jaya. 2 police officers were patrolling on a motorcycle. They were plainclothes officers, scanning for suspicious activity. They spotted the Proton Tiara. Something about it looked wrong. They signaled the car to stop. Ahmad Najib pulled over. This was it. The miracle Canny needed. The officers approached the vehicle. They saw a man in the driver's seat and a woman in the passenger seat. One of the officers, a man named Ravindran, walked up to the window. He looked at Canny. She was terrified. She couldn't speak freely, perhaps because of a knife or a threat she had already received, but she tried to communicate. She made strange hand gestures toward the officer. She moved her hands, her eyes wide, trying to signal distress without alerting her captor. It was a desperate, silent plea for help. Save me. This is not my husband. I am being taken. But communication is fragile. In the darkness, amidst the confusion of a traffic stop, the officer didn't understand what she was trying to say. The officers asked for identification. Ahmad Najib handed over his ID card. Canny handed over hers. The officers looked at the cards. They saw the names. They didn't match. They asked Ahmad Najib to step out of the vehicle. This was the critical juncture. If he stepped out, Canny was saved. But Ahmad Najib knew that stepping out meant prison. He refused. The tension spiked. Sensing that the officers were about to escalate, he slammed his foot on the accelerator. The car screeched away, leaving the officers standing on the roadside holding the ID cards. They reacted. They drew their weapons and fired at the fleeing car, trying to shoot out the tires. The gunshots rang out in the night air. But the car didn't stop. It disappeared into the maze of streets, lost in the shadows. The second near miss happened later, in an industrial area. The car had developed a problem, a flat tire, possibly from the police gunfire or from the rough driving. Ahmad Najib was forced to stop to change it. A woman named Amina was passing by. She saw the car, she saw the man struggling with the tire, and she saw Kani sitting inside. Amina was observant. She noticed the woman in the car was making odd faces at her. Kani was grimacing, contorting her expression, trying to convey terror to this stranger. Amina sensed the danger. She felt in her gut that this was not a normal situation. She didn't approach it, would have been too dangerous, but she did something brilliant. She wrote down the license plate number. Before she could do anything else, Ahmad Najib gave up on the tire and drove away again, the car limping along on the rim. Amina went straight to a police station in Subang Jaya to report what she had seen. She gave them the plate number. It was a crucial piece of evidence that would help lead investigators to the killer. But for Kani, it was too late. The window of opportunity had closed. Between 1 and 5 in the morning, Ahmad Najib drove Kani to a desolate construction site near Old Klang Road. It was an area under development, filled with concrete pillars, dirt mounds, and shadows. It was underneath a bridge that was still being built. It was here, in the filth and the dark, that the nightmare reached its crescendo. He assaulted her. The violence was prolonged and unspeakable. Kani, the brilliant analyst, the loving daughter, was subjected to the worst kind of brutality, and when he was finished, he decided she could not live. He took a knife and stabbed her twice in the abdomen. The wounds were fatal. Kani Ong bled to death on the dirty ground of a construction site, miles from the people who loved her. Ahmad Najib then began the process of disposal. He didn't just want to hide the body, he wanted to erase it. He dragged her remains to a narrow hole, a manhole or a culvert near the highway. He pushed her body inside. To ensure she wouldn't be found, he covered her with 2 large tires that had been filled with cement. It was a heavy, permanent seal. He abandoned Kani's car at a nearby shop house and fled the scene in a taxi. He went home, perhaps washed his clothes, and tried to sleep. But the paranoia of the killer set in. He worried about evidence. The next day, he bought petrol. He returned to the construction site. He poured the fuel into the hole, over Kani's body, and set it on fire. He tried to burn away the DNA, the identity, the humanity of his victim. For 4 days, Kani's family lived in a state of suspended agony. Her father, weak from cancer, waited for news of his daughter. The police searched. The media broadcast her photo. The entire nation of Malaysia held its breath. Then, on the morning of June 17th, a construction site manager smelled something terrible. He followed the scent to the hole near the highway. He looked inside and saw the charred remains of a human body. The victim's hands were crossed over her chest. A cloth was wrapped around her neck. Her legs dangled into the darkness. It was Kani. The discovery shattered the hope that had sustained her family. The identification process was a formality of grief. The police investigation moved swiftly now. Using the license plate number Amina had provided and the forensic evidence from the car, they tracked down Ahmad Najib. On June 20th, just days after the discovery of the body, they raided his home and arrested him. The forensic case against him was overwhelming. DNA tests confirmed that the biological fluids found on Kani's body matched Ahmad Najib. The cloth used to strangle her was identified as a specific type of cleaning cloth used by aircraft cabin cleaners, a direct link to his job. Witnesses, including the police officers from the traffic stop and Amina, identified him. Confronted with the mountain of evidence, Ahmad Najib confessed. He led the police through a reconstruction of the crime, retracing his steps from the shopping mall to the bridge. It was a detailed admission of guilt. But when the trial began, he recanted. He pleaded not guilty, claiming the confession was coerced. The trial was a spectacle. It lasted 52 days. The prosecution called 69 witnesses. The defense fought hard, challenging the admissibility of the confession. The judge eventually ruled the confession admissible, but noted that even without it, the forensic evidence was overpowering. On February 23, 2005, the Shah Alam High Court delivered its verdict: guilty. Ahmad Najib bin Aris was convicted of rape and murder. For the rape, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison and 10 strokes of the cane. For the murder, he was sentenced to death by hanging. He spent the next 11 years on death row, appealing every step of the way. His lawyers argued about procedure, about the confession, about everything they could. The appeals went all the way to the federal court, the highest land in the land. But the verdict stood. The evidence was too strong. The crime was too heinous. On September 23, 2016, 13 years after Kani walked into that parking garage, Ahmad Najib was led from his cell at Kajang prison. It was early morning. At 6 o'clock, the trapdoor opened. He was executed by hanging. His body was buried later that day in a Muslim cemetery. Kaniong's death changed Malaysia. It shattered the illusion of safety in public spaces. Shopping malls across the country overhauled their security. They installed brighter lighting in parking garages. They installed panic buttons. They hired more guards. They created ladies' parking zones near the entrances. The tragedy forced a nation to look at how it protected its women. But for Kani's family, these changes came too late. Her father died shortly after her murder, his final days darkened by the loss of his daughter, the husband she left behind in America, the mother and sister who watched her walk away from the dinner table. They are the ones who carry the weight of this story. It is a story of what-ifs. What if she hadn't gone back for the ticket? What if the police had shot out the tires? What if the window had been open a little wider? These questions haunt the narrative, reminding us of how thin the line is between survival and disaster. The rain in Kuala Lumpur is slowing now, the storm passing over the city. The neon lights reflect on the wet pavement, fracturing into 1,000 colors. We leave the humid streets of Malaysia and travel back across the Pacific Ocean. We are heading to the American West, to the mountains of Washington State. We are going to a place of towering pines and rushing rivers, where a father took his 3 daughters for a camping trip. But this was not a holiday. It was a goodbye, and in the silence of the Cascade Mountains, he would commit an act so unnatural it defies the instinct of every living thing. The rain in Kuala Lumpur fades into the mist. The humidity drops, replaced by a cool, crisp breeze carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. We are crossing the Pacific Ocean, landing in the rugged heart of the American Northwest. The Cascade Mountains of Washington State rise like jagged teeth against the sky, a landscape of breathtaking beauty where pristine forests hide deep, silent valleys. It is a place where people go to find peace, but in the spring of 2025, it became the setting for an act of betrayal, so profound it shatters the soul. Travis Caleb Decker was 32 years old. To the outside world, he was a man who had served his country. He joined the United States Army in 2012, becoming an infantryman. He had deployed to Afghanistan, spending months in a combat zone where the rules of civilized life are suspended. He returned home with medals, but he also returned with invisible wounds. The war had followed him back, manifesting as severe paranoia, nightmares that woke him screaming, and a restlessness that he could not shake. By 2025, his life had unraveled. His marriage to Whitney, the mother of his children, had collapsed under the weight of his mental instability. They had divorced, and Travis was now homeless, drifting between hotels and campgrounds. He had lost his anchor, but he still had one tether to the world of the living, his 3 daughters. Peyton was 9, a girl just starting to find her own voice. Evelyn was 8, the middle child navigating her place in the world. And Olivia was 5, the baby of the family. Despite his instability, Travis had always been a reliable father when it came to visitation. He followed the court orders, he showed up on time, he brought the girls back on time. His ex-wife, Whitney, though concerned about his mental health, trusted this routine. It was the one thing Travis seemed capable of maintaining. So, on Thursday, May 30th, 2025, when Travis picked up the girls for a scheduled 3-hour visit, no one suspected that this was the beginning of the end. The plan was simple. A few hours with Dad in the Wenatchee area, and then back to Mom's house by 8 o'clock in the evening. Overnight visits were prohibited by the court, a safeguard put in place to protect the children. The sun began to set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. 8 o'clock arrived. The driveway remained empty. 8:15 passed. 8:30. Whitney called Travis's phone. It went straight to voicemail. This was wrong. Travis never missed a drop-off. He always called if he was running late. The silence from his phone was louder than a scream. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in Whitney's chest. She drove to the Wenatchee Police Department. She stood at the desk, a mother sensing the abyss opening up beneath her feet, and reported her children missing. She told them about the custody order. She told them about his mental state. The police listened. They began to check the local hotels and campgrounds where Travis was known to stay. But when they requested an Amber Alert, the system designed to blast a warning to every phone and highway sign in the state, the request was denied. The authorities determined that there was not enough evidence to prove the children were in imminent grave danger. It is a bureaucratic phrase that would soon taste like ash in the mouths of everyone involved. Without the Amber Alert, the search was quieter. A missing endangered person alert was issued the next day, but the golden hours were slipping away. While the police searched the town, Travis was already miles away, deep in the wilderness he knew so well from his military training. He had driven his pickup truck to a remote area near Leavenworth, along Icicle Creek. It is a place of stunning natural beauty, where the water rushes over smooth stones and the trees tower overhead. On June 2nd, 3 days after the girls vanished, a deputy searching the area found the truck. It was parked near the abandoned Rock Island campground. The deputy approached the vehicle cautiously. The silence of the forest was heavy. As he got closer to the tailgate of the pickup, he saw something that stopped his heart. There were 2 bloody handprints smeared on the metal. They were crimson markers of violence in a place that should have been peaceful. The search radiated out from the truck. Deeper into the campground, away from the main trails, the searchers found them. The bodies of Peyton, Evelyn, and Olivia were discovered in a small clearing. It was a scene of calculated, intimate horror. They had not been shot. They had not been beaten. They had been suffocated. Travis had placed plastic bags over their small heads. The details are difficult to hear, but they are necessary to understand the depth of the tragedy. 2 of the girls had 2 separate bags over their heads. The youngest, 5-year-old Olivia, had 3 bags layered over her face. Their wrists were bound with zip ties, restraints used to prevent their small hands from tearing at the plastic that was cutting off their air. It was a slow death, a terrifying death. They would have been conscious. They would have looked at their father, the man who was supposed to protect them from the monsters, and realized that he was the monster. Travis had stood there and watched as the life faded from his daughter's eyes. He had waited until their hearts stopped beating. And then he had left them there, alone in the woods. Travis himself was gone. He had vanished into the vast wilderness of the Cascades. A massive manhunt was launched. This was not a search for a lost hiker. It was a hunt for a fugitive with infantry training. Travis knew how to navigate. He knew how to survive. He had previously disappeared into the woods for months at a time, living off the land. The police knew he could be anywhere. They found evidence of his mindset in his digital footprint. In the days before the murders, Travis had been searching the internet. He had Googled, how does a person move to Canada and how to relocate to Canada. He had been planning an escape, but whether he ever intended to take the girls with him, or if he always saw them as baggage to be discarded, remains a question only he could answer. DNA analysis confirmed the worst. Travis's genetic material was found on the plastic bags. It was found on the zip ties, and crucially, no one else's DNA was there. There was no accomplice, no shadowy figure, just a father and his 3 daughters in the woods. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree aggravated murder, but you cannot handcuff a ghost. For months, the search continued. Summer turned to autumn. The leaves in the Cascades began to turn gold and red. Then, on September 19th, nearly 4 months after the murders, searchers on Grindstone Mountain made a discovery. At an elevation of 4,000 feet, in terrain that is steep and unforgiving, they found human remains. The body was decomposed, ravaged by the elements and the scavengers of the forest. But the personal items scattered around it told the story. A shirt, shorts, a tin of chewing tobacco, a bracelet. DNA testing confirmed it was Travis Caleb Decker. He was dead. The medical examiner could not determine the cause of death due to the state of the remains. Had he taken his own life? Had he succumbed to the elements? Or had he simply laid down and died? We will never know if he died immediately after killing his daughters, or if he wandered the mountains for weeks, haunted by what he had done. The justice system listed the case as dismissed due to the death of the defendant, but there is no dismissal for the mother left behind. Whitney Decker released a statement through her attorney. She emphasized that Travis had never been violent toward them before. She spoke of the failure of the system, a veteran with severe mental illness, crying out for help, lost in a maze of bureaucracy at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Travis was a man broken by war, and in his brokenness, he destroyed the only pure thing in his life. The tragedy of the Decker family is a stark reminder that the wounds of war do not stay on the battlefield. They come home, and sometimes they bleed onto the innocent. The wind blows through the trees near Rock Island Campground. It rustles the plastic tape of the crime scene, now long abandoned. The river rushes by, indifferent to the grief it witnessed. 3 little girls went into the woods with their father, trusting him to bring them home. They never came back. As the rain falls, washing away the dust of the mountains, we must move on. We leave the silence of the Washington wilderness and cross the Atlantic Ocean. We are heading to the flat, open landscapes of the Netherlands, and then south to the steaming jungles of Panama. We are following the footsteps of 2 young women who went looking for adventure and found a mystery that has captivated the world. The rain falling on the Washington mountains fades into a distant memory, replaced by the sound of heavy, tropical drops hitting the canopy of a dense rainforest. The air grows thick and humid, carrying the scent of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and the sweet perfume of exotic flowers. We are leaving the United States and traveling south to the narrow bridge of land that connects the Americas. We are going to Panama. This is a story that has terrified the internet for a decade. It is a story of 2 vibrant young women who walked into a cloud forest and never walked out. It is a mystery composed of digital breadcrumbs, inexplicable photographs, and a blue backpack that traveled down a river to tell a story that no living person can confirm. The year is 2014. The place is Boquete, a quiet mountain town in the province of Chiriquí. Chris Kremers was 21 years old. She was open, creative, and described by her friends as the life of the party. With her striking strawberry blonde hair and bright blue eyes, she was a presence that drew people in. Lisanne Froon was 22. She was taller, an aspiring applied psychology graduate who was known for her intelligence and her more introspective nature. They were best friends from the Netherlands, two young women on the adventure of a lifetime. They had saved money for months, working in a restaurant to fund a 6-week trip to Panama. The plan was perfect, a mix of vacation and volunteer work. They wanted to learn Spanish, help local children, and explore the stunning natural beauty of Central America. They arrived in Panama in mid-March, spending 2 weeks traveling before settling in Boquete to begin their volunteer placement. Boquete is nestled in the highlands. It is a place of eternal spring, surrounded by coffee plantations and dominated by the looming silhouette of Volcan Baru, an active stratovolcano. The girls moved into a host family's home, ready to start their work. But when they arrived at the school on March 31st, they were told there had been a mistake. The program wasn't ready for them. They were told to come back in a week. Suddenly, they had free time, a whole week to explore. On April 1st, 2014, the weather was perfect. The sun was shining, illuminating the emerald green of the mountains. Chris and Lisanne decided to hike the El Pianista Trail. It is a popular route known for its beauty. It winds up through open fields before entering the cloud forest, eventually reaching a summit known as the Mirador, or the Lookout. They left the house around late morning, bringing with them a blue backpack. Inside, they packed the essentials for a day hike: water, snacks, their passports, $83 in cash, sunglasses, 2 mobile phones, and Lisanne's Canon PowerShot camera. They were dressed lightly in tank tops and shorts, prepared for the heat of the day, but not for the cold of the high-altitude night. They took a taxi to the trailhead. The driver dropped them off, and witnesses saw them start the ascent. They looked happy. They looked like any other tourists, enjoying a beautiful day. As they hiked, they stopped to take photos. The images recovered later show them smiling, posing against the backdrop of the valley, their faces flushed with exertion and joy. They reached the summit around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The Mirador is the end of the official trail. From there, you can see Boquete on one side and the vast, green expanse of the Caribbean slope on the other. Most hikers stop here, take a photo, and turn back. It is the safe thing to do. But the trail continues. It descends down the other side of the Continental Divide, into the wild, uninhabited jungle that stretches toward the sea. There is a sign there now, warning hikers not to go further. But on that day, perhaps the path looked inviting. Perhaps they thought it looped back to town. Or perhaps, filled with the confidence of youth, they simply wanted to see what was around the next bend. Whatever the reason, Chris and Lisanne crossed the divide. They walked away from safety and into a labyrinth of green. The last daylight photo was taken at 1:54 in the afternoon. It shows Chris crossing a stream. She is looking back at the camera, her expression unreadable. After that, the camera was put away. The documentation of their journey stops. What happened next is a reconstruction of terror based on the silent testimony of their electronic devices. Something went wrong. Did they lose the trail? The path on the Caribbean side is not maintained. It is a web of game trails and riverbeds that look like paths but lead nowhere. Did one of them fall? Did they encounter someone? We don't know. But we know that at 4:39 that afternoon, just a few hours after the last photo, the first alarm was raised. The logs on their phones show that one of them dialed 112, the international emergency number. It was followed shortly by a call to 911. Neither call connected. They were deep in the jungle, behind the mountain, far from any cell tower. They were alone, the sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping. The cloud forest at night is a different world. It is pitch black, freezing cold, and filled with the sounds of insects and predators. They survived the first night. We know this because the next morning, April 2nd, the phones were used again. Between 6:58 in the morning and late afternoon, they tried to call emergency services multiple times. Calls were made to 112 and 911. None of them went through. The desperation must have been suffocating. They were lost, perhaps injured, and the one device that could save them was useless. By April 3rd, the pattern changed. They stopped leaving the phones on. They began to power them on only for brief moments, checking for a signal and then turning them off to conserve battery. It was a rational, disciplined strategy for survival. It tells us they were still thinking clearly, still fighting to stay alive. But as the days passed, the situation grew more dire. On April 5th, the battery in Lisanne's phone died. It was never turned on again. Chris's iPhone remained the only lifeline. But something strange began to happen on April 6th. The phone was turned on, but the PIN code was entered incorrectly. It happened again and again. Someone was trying to access the phone but couldn't get in. Was Chris too weak to type? Was she delirious? Or was Lisanne trying to use Chris's phone after Chris had become incapacitated or passed away? The thought of one friend trying to save the other, fumbling with a code she didn't know in the darkness of the jungle, is heartbreaking. By April 11th, 10 days after they disappeared, the phone was turned on for the last time. It stayed on for an hour, searching for a signal that never came. Then, it died. Back in Boquete, the alarm had been raised. The host family noticed the girls hadn't returned. A guide who was supposed to meet them on April 2nd found an empty house. The police were notified. A massive search operation began. Helicopters swept the canopy. Dogs sniffed the trails. Ground teams hacked through the bush. The girls' parents flew in from the Netherlands, bringing Dutch detectives with them. They searched for weeks. They offered a $30,000 reward. They walked the same trails, calling out their daughters' names. But the jungle is vast and dense. It swallows sound and hides secrets. Despite the massive effort, not a single trace of Chris or Lisanne was found. The rainy season began, washing away footprints and turning the trails into mudslides. Hope began to fade. 10 weeks passed. The story had begun to fade from the headlines. Then, in June, an indigenous woman from the Alto Romero region made a discovery. She was walking along the bank of a river, miles from where the girls had last been seen. She found a blue backpack wedged between some rocks and driftwood. She opened it. Inside, she found 2 pairs of sunglasses, $83 in cash, 2 bras, a water bottle, and a passport. It was Lisanne Froon's passport. The woman traveled to Boquete and turned the bag over to the authorities. The discovery electrified the investigation. The backpack was dry inside. The electronics were intact. The police accessed the camera. They found the happy photos from the hike. But then they found something else. Something that defied explanation. On the night of April 8th, a week after the girls disappeared, the camera had been used again. In the middle of the pitch-black jungle, someone had taken 90 flash photographs in the span of 3 hours. Most of the photos show nothing but darkness or rain, but some show terrifying glimpses of their reality. There is a photo of a rock with a candy wrapper sitting on it. There is a photo of a makeshift marker made of sticks and plastic bags, possibly an SOS signal. There is a photo of the ground, illuminated by the harsh flash, showing mud and roots. And then there is the most haunting image of all. It is a photo of the back of Chris's head. Her strawberry blonde hair is matted and wet. There is blood on her temple. The photo is taken from a low angle, as if the photographer was lying on the ground. Why were these photos taken? Were they trying to use the flash to signal a helicopter they heard overhead? Were they trying to use the light to see something in the dark? Or was it the last, desperate act of a dying mind? There was another mystery on the camera. Photo number 509 was missing. The file numbering jumped from 508, the last daytime photo of Chris, to 5 to 10, the first night photo. The file had been deleted, but by whom and why? Deleted photos can usually be recovered, but this one was gone completely, as if the card had been overwritten or manipulated on a computer. It fueled theories of a cover-up. Following the discovery of the backpack, searchers returned to the river. This time, they found remains. On June 19th, they found a pelvic bone. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Lisanne. Later, they found a hiking boot. Inside the boot was a human foot. It belonged to Lisanne. They found scattered rib bones belonging to Chris. The condition of the remains raised more questions than it answered. There were only a few bones found, scattered over a large area. The forensic pathologist noted something disturbing. The bones belonging to Chris appeared to be bleached. They were white and clean, devoid of any tissue. This process usually takes months or years in a natural setting or exposure to strong chemicals. Lisanne's remains, however, were in a different stage of decomposition. Why the difference? Some experts argued that the different microenvironments of the jungle floor could explain it. Others saw it as evidence that someone had used chemicals, perhaps lime, to accelerate decomposition and hide the crime. The official conclusion from the Panamanian authorities was that the girls had gotten lost. They had succumbed to the elements, or perhaps fallen from one of the dangerous monkey bridges that cross the rivers. Their bodies had decomposed, and the rising river waters had scattered their bones downstream. It was a tragic accident. But this explanation has never satisfied everyone. The dry backpack, found in a wet environment, the deleted photo, the bleached bones, the lack of any message on the phones, despite days of usage. Why didn't they type a note? Why didn't they record a video? Was there a third party involved? Did they meet someone on the trail who led them astray? Some theories point to the local guide, or to a gang operating in the area, but no concrete evidence has ever linked anyone to the deaths. The backpack provided the timeline, but it didn't provide the cause. The El Pianista Trail is still there. The wind still blows through the cloud forest. Hikers still go up to the mirador to look at the view. But now, there is a shadow over the mountain. The story of Chris and Lisanne has become a modern cautionary tale about the indifference of nature. It reminds us that the line between a perfect vacation and a nightmare is as thin as a dying battery. Imagine the darkness of those nights, the rain falling on the leaves, the sound of the river rushing nearby, the flash of the camera popping in the dark, illuminating a small circle of terror in an endless sea of black. They were together until the end, two friends facing the unknown. As the jungle fades from view, the rain changes again. It becomes the salty spray of the Atlantic Ocean, hitting the windshield of a car driving along a lonely stretch of highway. We are returning to the United States, to the beaches of Long Island. We are going to a place where the sand dunes hide a graveyard, and a killer used a telephone to torture the living. The rain shifts again. It loses the tropical warmth of the Panamanian jungle and turns cold, bracing, and salty. It whips across the gray Atlantic, driving hard against the windshield of a police cruiser patrolling a lonely stretch of highway. We are returning to the United States, specifically to the southern shore of Long Island, New York. Here, a thin ribbon of sand and asphalt separates the ocean from the bay, a place of wild, windswept beauty that hides a graveyard in the dunes. This is the story of the Gilgo Beach murders, a case that began with the disappearance of one woman and unraveled to reveal a serial killer who had been hunting in the shadows for nearly 2 decades. It is a story about the women who were lost, the families who never stopped searching, and the terrible secrets that can be buried just feet from a busy road where thousands of people drive every summer day, completely unaware of the horrors hidden in the scrub brush. Ocean Parkway is the artery that connects the beach communities of Jones Beach, Gilgo Beach, and Oak Beach. It is a scenic drive, flanked by tall grasses and twisted pines. In the summer, it is a corridor of joy, filled with families heading to the surf. But in the winter, or at night, it is a desolate place. The wind howls off the water, the fog rolls in, thick and blinding, and the isolation makes it a perfect place to hide things you never want found. The nightmare began on the night of May 1st, 2010. Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old woman, was working as an escort. She had traveled from New York City to Oak Beach, a gated community on the barrier island, to meet a client named Joseph Brewer. She arrived just after 2 in the morning, driven by a driver who waited outside. Everything seemed routine. But as the night wore on, something shifted in the atmosphere of that house. At approximately 4:45 in the morning, Shannon's behavior changed drastically. She appeared to be in the grip of a terrifying panic. She fled the house, running out into the darkness of the quiet, sleeping neighborhood. She didn't run to her driver. She ran to the neighbors. She pounded on the door of a resident named Gus Coletti. When he opened the door, he saw a woman who was incoherent with fear. She was screaming that they were trying to kill her. Coletti called 911 at 5:21 in the morning. Shannon ran from his porch, stumbling through the night to the home of Barbara Brennan, banging on her door as well. Brennan also called the police. But by the time the officers arrived at 5:40, Shannon Gilbert had vanished. She had disappeared into the marshland that surrounds the community, swallowed by the tall reeds and the darkness. The police assumed she had left with her driver. They didn't know she was the key to a Pandora's box. For 7 months, Shannon remained missing. Her mother, Mari Gilbert, refused to let the case die. She demanded that the police search for her daughter. She knew Shannon wouldn't just walk away. Finally, under pressure, the police returned to the area with cadaver dogs. On December 11, 2010, an officer was working his dog along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach, just a few miles west of where Shannon had last been seen. The dog, trained to detect the scent of death, alerted to a spot in the thick bramble on the north side of the road. The officer pushed through the brush and found a skeleton. It was wrapped in burlap, a rough, coarse fabric used for gardening or potato sacks. The body was not Shannon Gilbert. It was Melissa Barthelemy, a 24-year-old woman who had disappeared from the Bronx in July 2009. The discovery changed everything. Police realized they weren't just looking for a missing person, they were standing in a crime scene. They widened the search. 2 days later, on December 13th, they found 3 more bodies. They were all found within a quarter-mile stretch of the highway, spaced about 500 feet apart. Like Melissa, they were all wrapped in burlap. Like Melissa, they were all young women who worked as escorts. The victims became known as the Gilgo Four. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, a mother of 2 from Connecticut, who had vanished in 2007. Melissa Barthelemy, 24. Megan Waterman, 22, a mother from Maine who disappeared in June 2010. And Amber Lynn Costello, 27, who lived nearby in West Babylon and vanished in September 2010. The timeline revealed a predator who had been active for years, picking off vulnerable women one by one. But the horror of this case was not just in the killing, it was in the cruelty that followed. After Melissa Barthelemy disappeared in 2009, her younger sister, Amanda, began receiving phone calls. They came from Melissa's own cell phone. The voice on the other end was male, calm, and sadistic. He taunted the grieving family. He asked Amanda, "Do you think you'll ever see your sister again?" He listened to her cry. Then, in a later call, he delivered the crushing blow. He told her calmly and coldly, "I killed her." He described what he had done to her in graphic detail. These weren't just prank calls. They were a form of psychological torture designed to extend the pain of the murder. The killer was getting off on the suffering of the family. Police traced the calls. They pinged off cell towers in Midtown Manhattan, near Madison Square Garden and Times Square. These are some of the busiest places on Earth, filled with millions of people. The killer was hiding in the crowd, making his calls from the heart of the city before disappearing back into the anonymity of the streets. It was a chilling detail. A monster who walked among the throngs of commuters and tourists, holding a dead woman's phone. The discovery of the Gilgo 4 was just the beginning. As police continued to scour the brush along Ocean Parkway, the graveyard grew. Between March and April 2011, they found 6 more sets of remains. Some were just bones. Some had been there for a decade or more. They found Jessica Taylor, a 20-year-old woman whose partial remains had been found 40 miles away in Manorville back in 2003. Now, her other remains were found at Gilgo. They found Valerie Mack, who had vanished in 2000. They found the remains of a female toddler. They found a young Asian male dressed in women's clothing. And they found Peaches, an unidentified woman whose torso had been found in 1997. It became clear that Ocean Parkway was not just a dumping ground. It was a personal cemetery for a serial killer, or perhaps multiple killers. The sheer volume of death hidden in the scrub was staggering. 11 sets of remains, at least 10 victims. For years, people had driven past this spot on their way to the beach, listening to the radio, laughing with their children, never knowing that just a few yards away, bodies were decomposing in burlap sacks. In December 2011, over a year after she vanished, investigators finally found Shannon Gilbert. Her belongings, jeans, shoes, pocketbook, were found in the marsh near Oak Beach. Her skeletal remains were found shortly after. The medical examiner ruled her death accidental, possibly drowning or hypothermia from getting lost in the marsh while in a drug-induced panic. They said she was not a victim of the serial killer. Her family never accepted this. They believed she was murdered, that her running away was a desperate flight from a killer. Regardless of how she died, Shannon Gilbert is the reason the others were found. If she hadn't run into the night, if she hadn't screamed for help, the police never would have brought the dogs to Ocean Parkway. The Gilgo 4 would still be waiting in the dark. Shannon Gilbert, in her death, shone a light on a decade of darkness. For 13 years, the case went cold. The wind blew through the pines. The sand covered the tracks. The families of the victims waited in agonizing limbo. The killer had stopped calling. He had seemingly vanished. But he hadn't left. He was still there, living a double life. He was a successful architect, commuting into the city every day, walking the same streets where he had made those taunting calls. He went home to his wife and children in a dilapidated house in Massapequa Park, just a short drive from the graveyard he had created. He lived among his neighbors, a quiet, strange man who kept to himself. He thought he had gotten away with it. He thought the burlap sacks and the ocean air had destroyed the evidence. But he was wrong. He left something behind. A hair, a pizza crust, a digital footprint that would never fade. In the next story, we will examine the hunt for this man. We will look at how modern technology resurrected a cold case, and how a discarded piece of trash in a Manhattan trash can brought down a monster who had been hiding in plain sight for almost 30 years. The rain is stopping now, the fog is lifting, and the architect is about to be exposed. The fog that shrouded the dunes of Gilgo Beach lifts, revealing the sharp steel skyline of Manhattan. We are leaving the wind-swept isolation of Ocean Parkway and entering the grid of the city, a place of order, surveillance, and anonymity. The year is 2022. The Gilgo Beach case has been cold for more than a decade. To the public, it is a ghost story, a terrifying legend of a killer who vanished into the mist. But behind the closed doors of the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, a new fire has been lit. A specialized task force has been assembled. This is not the investigation of the past, hampered by infighting and technological limitations. This is a team armed with the cutting edge of forensic science, genetic genealogy, and digital analytics. They are looking at the old evidence with new eyes, searching for the needle in a haystack that had grown over 13 years. And deep in the mountain of data, they found a thread. The killer had been careful, but he had not been invisible. He had used burner phones, prepaid, disposable cell phones to contact his victims. In the early 2010s, these phones were considered anonymous. But technology has evolved. The task force began to analyze the historic cell site data, the records of which towers the killer's phones had pinged when he made those calls. They looked for patterns, they looked for a ghost in the machine, and they found one. They discovered that the burner phones used to contact the victims were often located in two specific areas: Massapequa Park, a suburb on Long Island, and Midtown Manhattan, specifically near the grand transportation hubs of Penn Station and the Port Authority. This was a massive breakthrough. It suggested a commuter, someone who lived in the suburbs and worked in the city. The investigators then did something brilliant. They overlaid the movement of these burner phones with the movement of millions of personal cell phones active at the same time. They were looking for a shadow, a personal phone that moved in perfect synchronization with the burner phones. It was a digital manhunt, sifting through haystacks of data to find two needles moving together. And then a name emerged. Rex Andrew Hoyerman. He was 59 years old. He lived in Massapequa Park, in the very box where the burner phones slept at night. He worked as an architect in Midtown Manhattan, in the very box where the burner phones woke up during the day. He was a large man, imposing, with a disheveled appearance that neighbors found odd but not criminal. Rex Hoyerman was not a drifter. He was a fixture of the city's infrastructure. He owned his own architectural consulting firm. He was a man who understood structure, design, and the details of buildings. He had worked on projects throughout New York City for decades, navigating the complex bureaucracy of building codes and zoning laws. He was a professional. He wore a suit. He carried a briefcase. He had a wife, Asa Ellerup, and 2 children. They lived in a small, dilapidated house on First Avenue in Massapequa Park, the same house where Hoyerman had grown up. To his neighbors, he was a bit of a recluse, a man who glared at people who walked too close to his property. But nobody looked at the architect with the messy house and saw a serial killer. The task force began to watch him. They couldn't just arrest him based on cell tower data. They needed physical proof. They needed DNA. The old investigation had recovered hairs from the bodies of the victims. Hairs found on Megan Waterman and Amber Costello. But in 2010, the technology didn't exist to get a nuclear DNA profile from a rootless hair. In 2023, it did. The investigators needed a sample of Hoyerman's DNA to compare to the hairs found on the bodies. They couldn't ask him for it. They had to steal it. They set up a surveillance operation that would rival a spy novel. They watched him commute. They watched him walk down Fifth Avenue. They watched him eat lunch. In January 2023, the moment arrived. Hoyerman was observed throwing away a pizza box into a public trash can in Manhattan. As soon as he was out of sight, investigators swooped in. They retrieved the box. Inside was the crust of the pizza he had eaten. It was garbage to him, but to the task force, it was gold. They rushed the crust to the lab. They extracted the DNA left by his saliva. They compared it to the hair found on the burlap-wrapped remains of Megan Waterman, found 13 years earlier. It was a match. The probability that it was someone else was 1 in billions. They had him. But they didn't stop there. They also looked at the hairs found on the victims that belonged to a female. They suspected these hairs belonged to Hoyerman's wife, transferred innocently from his clothes to the victims. They obtained DNA from bottles left outside the Hoyerman home. It matched. The hairs on the bodies belonged to his wife. Crucially, this did not implicate her in the murders. In fact, it helped build the timeline of the killer's methodology. Investigators checked travel records and discovered a chilling pattern. Every time a victim disappeared, Asa Ellerup and the children were out of town. When Melissa Barthélemy vanished in July 2009, the family was away. When Megan Waterman disappeared in June 2010, the family was away. When Amber Costello vanished in September 2010, the family was away. Rex Hoyerman wasn't just an opportunist. He was a planner. He waited for his house to be empty. He waited until he had the privacy to bring his victims into his own basement. The digital evidence deepened the horror. Hoyerman had used multiple email accounts under fake names. He used them to access the dark corners of the internet. His search history was a window into a depraved mind. He searched for torture porn. He searched for information about the Gilgo Beach investigation, obsessively tracking the police progress to see if they were getting close. He searched for images of the victims and their families. He was watching them grieve. He was reliving his crimes. And perhaps most disturbingly, investigators found a document on his computer. It was a file that prosecutors described as a blueprint for murder. This was not a diary, it was a project plan. It outlined, in methodical detail, his process. It had sections on preparation, on supplies, and on cleanup. It discussed the importance of controlling the victim. It mentioned sleep and play in contexts that suggested torture. It was the work of an architect applying the logic of construction to the destruction of human life. The document was a manifesto of sadism. It suggested that he had refined his methods over decades, learning from mistakes, perfecting his kill kit. It listed items like burlap, tape, and drop cloths. It was the checklist of a man who viewed murder as a logistical challenge to be managed. On July 13, 2023, the net closed. Rex Hoyerman walked out of his office in Midtown Manhattan. The streets were busy with the summer crowd. He was wearing his suit, carrying his bag, looking like any other commuter heading home. He didn't know that his freedom, which he had abused for so long, was about to end. Police officers swarmed him. He was taken into custody without incident. The ogre of Gilgo Beach, the man who had terrified Long Island for a generation, was handcuffed on a city sidewalk. The news broke instantly. The architect, the father, the monster. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. Later, as the evidence was processed, he was charged with the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, completing the circle of the Gilgo Four. But the horror wasn't contained to the original 4. The investigation expanded. In June 2024, Hoyerman was charged with the murder of Jessica Taylor, the young woman whose remains had been scattered across the island. He was charged with the murder of Sandra Costilla, killed way back in 1993. This charge was significant. It pushed the timeline back by 17 years. It meant that Rex Hoyerman hadn't started killing in 2007. He had been killing since the early 90s. He had been a predator for most of his adult life. In December 2024, another charge was added, the murder of Valerie Mack. 7 murders, 7 women, 7 lives extinguished by a man who went to work, paid his taxes, and complained about his neighbors. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. He sits in a cell now, awaiting trial, stripped of his suits and his architectural plans. The search of his home in Massapequa Park was a spectacle. Police in hazmat suits spent days sifting through the clutter. They found a vault in the basement. They found hundreds of guns. They found a doll in a glass case. They dismantled the house, peeling back the layers of hoarding to find the trophies of a serial killer. His wife, Asa, filed for divorce immediately. Her life and the lives of their children were shattered. They were victims too, living in a house of horrors without knowing it, sleeping above the basement where women may have taken their last breaths. They were the camouflage that allowed him to blend in. The arrest of Rex Horman brought a measure of closure, but it also brought a new kind of pain. It confirmed that the monster was real. It confirmed that he was human. He wasn't a phantom of the dunes. He was a guy who ate pizza and threw the crust away. He was a guy who bought burner phones at the mall. The Gilgo Beach case is a testament to the power of science and persistence. It shows that even the coldest cases can burn again if you look at them with the right eyes. The burner phones, once thought to be untraceable, became the GPS trackers that led straight to his front door. The hair, once too small to test, became the genetic fingerprint that locked the handcuffs. But as we close the file on the architect, we are left with the heavy silence of the victims. Maureen, Melissa, Megan, Amber, Jessica, Sandra, Valerie. They were not blueprints. They were not projects. They were people. And while the architect sits in his cell, the wind still blows through the tall grass of Gilgo Beach, whispering the names of the women who will never go home. The rain outside has stopped. The air is still. But there is one more story to tell. A story that takes us away from the calculated evil of a serial killer and into the chaotic, terrifying realm of shared madness. We are going back to Taiwan, to an apartment building where the noises from upstairs were not just annoying, they were the sounds of a family descending into hell. The rain that washed the streets of Manhattan clean has stopped. The air is still now, but it is not peaceful. It is heavy, stagnant, and suffocating. We are crossing the Pacific one last time, descending into the neon-lit density of Kaohsiung City, Taiwan. This is a place where ancient traditions rub shoulders with modern life, where temples sit in the shadow of skyscrapers. But in April 2005, in a nondescript apartment building in the Gushan district, something ancient and terrifying took root. This final story is perhaps the most disturbing of them all. It does not involve a serial killer or a hitman. It does not involve a gun or a knife. It involves a family that loved each other, a family that wanted to save each other. And in their desperate attempt to drive out a demon that existed only in their minds, they descended into a madness so profound it destroyed them from the inside out. The protagonist of our story is a young man, a neighbor living on the floor below the Wu family. He was an ordinary resident, living a quiet life in the vertical sprawl of the city. He knew the family upstairs only by the sounds they made, and they made a lot of noise. The Wu family was known in the building for being deeply religious, bordering on eccentric. They were devotees of a specific folk religion, and their worship involved enthusiastic, physical rituals. The young man was accustomed to the thumping of feet against his ceiling. He was used to the rhythmic chanting that would filter down through the floorboards at odd hours. He was a respectful neighbor. He understood that people practiced their faith in different ways, and he never complained. He simply turned up the volume on his television and let the sounds of the Wu family fade into the background noise of the city. But on the night of April 9th, 2005, the sounds changed. The young man was sitting in his living room, the blue light of the TV flickering across his face. Above him, the familiar thumping began. Thump, thump, thump. It was rhythmic, heavy, like a drum beat made of flesh and bone hitting the floor. Then came the chanting, but this wasn't the melodic prayer he was used to. It was frantic. It was desperate. He muted his television. He sat there in the silence of his own apartment, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening. The thumping grew louder. The chanting became shouting. The voices upstairs sounded strained, pushed to the breaking point. And then, piercing through the concrete and the plaster, came a scream. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated agony. It wasn't part of a ceremony. It wasn't theatrical. It was the sound of a human being in mortal distress. The young man stood up. His instinct was to intervene, to go upstairs and check on his neighbors. He took a step toward the door. But then, as abruptly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence slammed into the building. The thumping ceased, the chanting cut off, the screaming ended. The sudden quiet was more unnerving than the noise had been. The young man stood in his living room, waiting for the next sound. A door slamming, a voice, sirens, but there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic of Kaohsiung. He hesitated. We have all been there. The moment of indecision where social norms war with gut instinct. Do you knock on a neighbor's door and risk embarrassment? Or do you mind your own business? The silence stretched on. Eventually, he convinced himself that the ritual had simply ended. He sat back down. He turned the TV back on. He tried to forget the sound of that scream. 2 days passed. 48 hours of silence from the apartment upstairs. No thumping, no chanting. On April 11th, the young man was back in his living room. The afternoon sun was fading. Suddenly, there was a pounding on his own front door. It was urgent, frantic. Bang, bang, bang. He got up and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was Wu Shan, the patriarch of the Wu family. The man looked like a ghost. He was dressed entirely in black, a stark contrast to the pale, sickly pallor of his skin. He was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, his eyes sunken and wild. He looked like a man who hadn't slept or eaten in weeks. But it was the smell that hit the neighbor first. It was a wave of foul, organic stench that rolled off Wu Shan like a physical force. He was covered in filth. There were stains on his clothes, ash, food, and other substances that the neighbor couldn't identify. He smelled of decay and waste. The neighbor, shocked, asked, "Is everything okay?" He was remembering the scream from 2 nights ago. He was looking at this broken man and realizing that something terrible had happened. Wu Shan stared at him with vacant eyes. He didn't explain. He didn't ask for help for himself. He simply said 3 words, "Call an ambulance." And then, before the neighbor could ask who was hurt, Wu Shan turned and ran. He didn't go back into his apartment. He ran down the stairs, fleeing the building, disappearing into the street. The young man was left standing in the doorway, the smell of the encounter lingering in the air. "Call an ambulance." The instruction was clear. He knew he had to go upstairs. He had to see what was behind the silence. He walked up the flight of stairs to the Wu family's apartment. The smell grew stronger with every step. It was a thick, cloying miasma of excrement and rot. He reached the door. It was closed. He knocked, holding his breath. "Hello?" No answer. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open. The air that rushed out was nearly unbreathable. He stepped inside, covering his nose and mouth with his shirt. The apartment, usually a place of order and worship, was a scene of devastation. It was filthy. The floor was covered in debris. The windows were closed, trapping the heat and the stench. He walked through the hallway, calling out, his voice trembling. He reached the living room, and there, in the center of the floor, he found the source of the silence. Lying on the ground was the body of the Wu family's eldest daughter, a 28-year-old woman. She was motionless. Her skin was bruised, her mouth was open, she was dead. The neighbor recoiled, the horror of the scene overwhelming him. He scrambled back out of the apartment and called the police. When the authorities arrived, they uncovered a story that is almost impossible to comprehend. The Wu family, the parents and their 4 adult children, had succumbed to a collective delusion known as folie à deux, or in this case, folie à famille. It is a rare psychiatric syndrome where a delusion is transmitted from one individual to another, spreading like a virus through a close-knit group. It had started weeks earlier. The eldest daughter had fallen ill. She claimed she was being possessed by demons. In a traditional household, this might be met with prayer or a visit to a doctor. But the Wu family was isolated in their belief system. They bypassed medical help and turned inward. They became convinced that the illness was spiritual, not physical. They tried to exorcise the demon, but the delusion spread. Soon, other members of the family began to feel possessed. They claimed to see deities and spirits. They stopped sleeping. They stopped eating normal food. The paranoia grew until the entire family was locked in a shared nightmare, convinced that evil entities were inside them, controlling them. They came to a horrifying conclusion. They believed that the demons thrived on purity and were repelled by filth. To drive the demons out, they had to make their bodies uninhabitable. They had to debase themselves. And so, the ritual began. For days, the family engaged in acts of self-torture and degradation. They beat each other with spirit, money, and wooden planks to hit the demons. They splashed burning incense on each other's skin. But the core of their cure was consumption. They believed they had to consume waste to disgust the spirits. They ate their own feces. They drank their own urine. When their bodies rejected the toxins and they vomited, they forced themselves to consume the vomit again. It was a cycle of biological horror, driven by love and fear. They were trying to save each other, but they were poisoning themselves. On April 9th, the night the neighbor heard the scream, the ritual reached its fatal climax. The family had surrounded the eldest daughter. They believed the demon was strongest in her. They tried to expel it physically. They pinned her down. They forced the waste into her mouth. They suffocated her in a frenzy of healing. The autopsy revealed the grim truth. The young woman had not died from a demon. She had died from multiple organ failure and asphyxiation. Her airway was blocked by feces and vomit. She had drowned in the filth that her family believed would save her. After the death, the spell broke, or perhaps fractured. The family fled. They scattered across the island, hiding in temples, terrified of the police and the demons they believed were still hunting them. But the authorities tracked them down one by one. They were arrested and charged with abandonment, resulting in death. It seemed like a clear case of cult-like abuse. But when the case went to trial, the court was faced with a difficult question. Were these people criminals, or were they victims of their own minds? Psychiatrists evaluated the surviving family members. They found that during the month leading up to the death, the family had been living in a state of mass hysteria. They were completely detached from reality. They genuinely believed they were fighting a spiritual war. They did not intend to kill their daughter. They intended to save her. The court ruled that because of this collective mental breakdown, they could not be held criminally responsible for their actions. They were acquitted of the homicide charges. They were sent for psychiatric treatment, not prison. The Wu family tragedy serves as a terrifying reminder of the fragility of the human mind. We like to think that we are rational beings, grounded in reality. But under the right conditions, isolation, fear, and intense emotional pressure, reality can crack. A belief can become a monster. A family can become a danger to itself. The apartment in Kaohsiung is quiet now. The smell has faded. But for the neighbor who opened that door, the memory of the thumping, the chanting, and the final silence will never leave. It is a story that whispers to us from the dark. Be careful what you believe, for the mind can build a hell just as easily as it can build a heaven. And so, we come to the end of our journey. 15 stories, 15 glimpses into the abyss. We have traveled from the frozen Antarctic to the jungles of Panama, from the deserts of Australia to the high rises of Taiwan. We have seen the faces of killers and the faces of victims. We have seen the best of humanity in the searchers who never gave up, and the worst of humanity in the predators who took everything. The rain outside has stopped. The night is quiet. You are safe in your bed. The monsters we talked about tonight are far away, locked in the past or locked in cells. But the lessons they teach us remain. Check your locks. Trust your instincts. Hold your loved ones close. If you are still awake, and if these stories have touched you, please leave a comment below. Tell me which story will keep you up tonight. Tell me where you are listening from. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. We delve into the darkness every week, and I would hate for you to walk that path alone.